Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quiet hours stretch out long and slow, and the world's most distant corners feel somehow closer in the dark. Tonight we're going to a place that does not look like much on a map. Just a single point. A dot, really. Sitting at the very bottom of the globe, surrounded by nothing in every direction for hundreds of miles. No coastline, no mountain visible from a distance, no river to follow, no city lights on the horizon, just ice and wind, and an emptiness so complete that even the sky above it seems to press down a little harder than it does anywhere else on Earth. That point is the South Pole, and for a long time it existed only as an idea, a mathematical certainty, a place that had to be there because geometry demanded it, but that no human being had ever actually stood upon. Cartographers drew it on their maps with quiet confidence, placing the label at the bottom of the world as if it were simply a fact, which in a sense it was. The fact of its location was never in doubt. The fact of whether anyone could reach it was another matter entirely. There is something strange about a blank space on a map. Not a blank space because the land is unknown, but a blank space because the land is unreachable. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were full of men who looked at those blanks and felt something close to physical discomfort. The world was being mapped, connected, measured, and claimed. Railroads were crossing continents. Telegraph cables were running under oceans. Explorers were returning from jungles and deserts with notes and specimens and stories. And yet, at the very bottom of the planet, there was still this one place, untouched, unnamed by any human foot, waiting. By 1911, the South Pole had become what historians sometimes call a psychological obsession for the age. It was not just a geographic goal. It was a symbol of something, of human ambition, national pride, scientific curiosity, and that particular kind of stubbornness that makes a person look at a place no one has ever survived and think, quietly, that they might be the one to change that. And in the year 1911, two expeditions were racing toward it at the same time. One came from Norway, led by a man named Roald Amundsen, a methodical, quietly competitive polar explorer who had spent most of his adult life preparing for exactly this kind of journey, whether he knew it yet or not. His team sailed south in a ship called the Fram, and they made their base on the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, in a bay where the ice itself was stable enough to build upon. The other came from Britain, led by Robert Falcon Scott, a Royal Navy officer who had already made one journey to Antarctica and had returned a national hero. His expedition was larger, more publicly celebrated, and carried with it the weight of an entire country's expectation. His ship was the Terra Nova, and his base was on the rocky shore of Cape Evans on Ross Island. Neither man could see the other. They were separated by hundreds of miles of ice and mountain and silence. But both of them knew the other was there, and both of them knew that only one could be first. That is the story we're spending tonight with. Not just who got there first, but how they got there, what it cost them, what they found when they arrived, and what happened afterward. To the men, to the memory, and to that small, cold, unremarkable point at the very bottom of the world. Before we go any further, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm, bundled under a blanket with the window dark outside? Or maybe it is the middle of the afternoon where you are, and this is your quiet moment in the middle of a busy day. What is the temperature where you are right now, I ask, because it is going to feel rather relevant in a little while, when we start talking about temperatures that most thermometers were not even designed to measure. Whatever the answer is, I hope you are comfortable. You deserve to be. And if this kind of slow, careful storytelling is something you enjoy, the kind that takes its time, that does not rush past the interesting parts, that tries to make a distant world feel close enough to almost touch, then I would be genuinely grateful if you liked this video and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It is a small thing, but it helps this channel find its way to other people who might want exactly this kind of company at the end of a long day. Thank you, truly. Now, let us go south. Let. The year 1911 sits in an interesting place in history. The world was modern enough to have photographs, telegraphs, steamships, and newspapers that could reach most of the globe within days. But it was still old enough that large portions of the Earth remained genuinely unexplored. The interior of Antarctica was one of those portions, not just unvisited, actively hostile to the idea of being visited. The continent is roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined. Its interior sits on a plateau of ice more than 2 miles thick in places. The average annual temperature at the South Pole is around -49 degrees Celsius. Winds can reach hurricane force. Storms appear without warning. The sun disappears entirely for months at a time, and when it returns it circles the sky without ever setting, which creates its own kind of disorientation. It is, in short, not a place that welcomes visitors. And yet, in the spring of 1911, 2 groups of men were preparing to walk across it. On foot, on skis, with dogs and sledges and carefully packed supplies, aiming for a point that offered no shelter, no reward in any material sense, and no guarantee of return. What drove them there is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Some of it was national pride. Britain and Norway were both ambitious nations in that era, and planting a flag at the South Pole carried real symbolic weight. Some of it was scientific. Scott's expedition in particular had a serious research program attached to it, and the men carried instruments and notebooks alongside their food and fuel. Some of it was personal. Amundsen had been working toward a polar record for years. Scott had unfinished business with the southern continent, and some of it was simply that oldest of human impulses, the desire to go somewhere no one has gone, to see something no one has seen, to be for one moment the first. Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott. 2 men, 2 ships, 2 approaches, 1 destination. Their stories are intertwined in a way that history rarely arranges quite so neatly, and they ended very differently. One story ends with a quiet flag planted in white emptiness and a long, efficient journey home. The other ends with a tent, a blizzard, and a silence that lasted months before anyone found it. We will get to all of that. But first, we need to understand who these men were and how they came to be standing at opposite ends of the world's most inhospitable continent, each one looking south, each one thinking about the same small dot on the map. Because the race to the South Pole did not begin in 1911. It began much earlier, in the childhoods and choices and obsessions of 2 very different men, shaped by very different ideas about what exploration was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to cost. Roald Amundsen was born on July 16th, 1872 in a small town called Borge in southeastern Norway. He grew up in a country that had a long, practical relationship with cold and ice, where skiing was not a sport but simply how you moved in winter, where the sea was not a backdrop but a livelihood, and where the idea of enduring difficult conditions was not considered particularly remarkable. It was just part of life. That background matters, because Amundsen did not approach polar exploration the way a romantic adventurer might. He approached it the way a craftsman approaches a difficult piece of work. Carefully, methodically, with enormous respect for the thing that could kill him. As a boy, he read everything he could find about the Arctic. One story in particular seems to have lodged itself deeply in his imagination. It was the story of John Franklin, the British explorer who led an expedition into the Canadian Arctic in 1845 in search of the Northwest Passage and never came back. Both ships were lost. All 129 men died. The search expeditions that went looking for them over the following years found only fragments, frozen bodies, abandoned equipment, journals that ended mid-sentence. Franklin's disaster was one of the most discussed exploration tragedies of the 19th century, and for young Amundsen, it was not a story that inspired caution so much as a puzzle. Why did they fail? What did they do wrong? What would you need to know, and do, and prepare in order to survive where they did not? That question shaped the next several decades of his life. His mother wanted him to study medicine, and for a while he tried. But when she died in 1893, he was 21 years old, and finally free to pursue what he actually wanted. He dropped out of university and began the deliberate, almost systematic process of turning himself into a polar explorer. He went on long cross-country ski trips in the Norwegian mountains in winter. He slept outdoors in temperatures that most people would have considered genuinely dangerous, not to prove something to anyone, but because he understood that cold was the primary enemy, and the only way to understand an enemy was to spend time with it. He wanted his body to know cold the way a musician's fingers know a keyboard, without having to think about it. In 1897, at the age of 24, he signed on as first mate on a Belgian expedition to Antarctica. The ship was called the Belgica, and the expedition was led by a man named Adrien de Gerlache. It was not a comfortable journey. The Belgica became trapped in pack ice south of the Antarctic Circle in March 1898, and the crew spent the next 13 months locked in, drifting slowly with the ice, unable to free themselves. No expedition had ever wintered in Antarctic waters before. No one really knew what would happen to the men. Some of them didn't handle it well. The darkness, the cold, the confinement and the monotony drove several crew members to the edge of mental breakdown. The ship's doctor, an American named Frederick Cook, and Amundsen worked together to keep the crew as functional as possible, forcing exercise, managing food, maintaining routines. 2 men lost their minds entirely. The expedition survived, barely, and limped back to civilization in 1899. For Amundsen, the experience was invaluable. He had now seen what Antarctica could do to unprepared men. He had watched the specific ways that cold and darkness and isolation broke people down, and he had watched what kept them going. He filed all of it away. A few years later, he set out on the project that would make his name before the South Pole ever entered the picture. The Northwest Passage, the long-sought sea route through the Arctic archipelago north of Canada, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, had been the obsession of European explorers for centuries. Franklin had died trying to find it. Dozens of other expeditions had failed. In June 1903, Amundsen set out from Oslo in a small ship called the Gjør, with a crew of just 6 men. Not a grand national expedition, not a fleet of ships, a small, shallow draft vessel, carefully chosen for navigating the ice-choked channels of the Canadian Arctic, and a tiny team that could function in close quarters without destroying each other. They spent 2 winters in the Arctic, one of them at a place they named Gjørhavn on King William Island, where Amundsen spent months living with and learning from the local Netsilik Inuit people. This was not casual tourism. He was studying them with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He wanted to know how they built their sleds, how they handled their dogs, how they dressed for extreme cold, how they navigated across featureless white terrain, how they survived in conditions that killed Europeans. He adopted their techniques without embarrassment or hesitation. He wore fur clothing instead of wool. He learned to manage sled dogs not as draft animals, but as working partners with specific natures that had to be understood. He absorbed everything he could. In August 1905, the Gjør finally emerged into the Beaufort Sea, completing the Northwest Passage. It had taken 3 years, and Amundsen had done it with 6 men and a ship small enough that most naval officers of the time would have considered it barely adequate for coastal work. He arrived in Nome, Alaska in October 1906, and the world took notice. What is striking about the way Amundsen worked is how little he resembled the popular image of a heroic explorer. He was not a showman. He did not give rousing speeches or write in the florid, emotional style that many of his contemporaries favoured. His diaries and letters are practical, observational, sometimes dry. He was competitive, deeply so, but he kept that mostly to himself. He did not talk about glory. He talked about preparation. He talked about dogs, food weights, ski wax, weather patterns, depot distances, and caloric requirements. He thought about failure the way an engineer thinks about structural stress, not as something shameful to avoid mentioning, but as a real force that had to be accounted for in the design. He was also, it must be said, not always easy to be around. He could be cold in the human rather than the meteorological sense. He held grudges. He was demanding and not particularly generous with praise. Some of the men who sailed with him admired him enormously and found him inspiring. Others found him remote and difficult. Both things were probably true at the same time. The great explorers are rarely simple people. By 1909, Amundsen had his eye on the North Pole. He had been planning for years to mount a drift expedition across the Arctic Ocean, borrowing Nansen's famous ship the Fram for the purpose. The plan was ambitious and carefully thought through, as all his plans were. He had funding, he had a ship, he had a route in mind. And then, in April 1909, Frederick Cook announced that he had reached the North Pole in April of the previous year. A few months later, Robert Peary announced that he had reached it in April 1909. The two claims immediately became entangled in controversy, a dispute that has never been entirely resolved. But the result, from Amundsen's perspective, was the same either way. The North Pole as a destination was gone. Whether Cook got there, or Peary got there, or neither of them quite got there, the claim had been made, the headlines had been written, and the blank space on the map had been filled in. There was nothing left for him there. He sat with this for a while. And then, quietly, without telling almost anyone, he made his decision. He would go south instead. The secrecy of this pivot is one of the more remarkable things about Amundsen's character. He did not announce it. He did not consult widely. He told his brother Leon and essentially no one else. He kept planning the North Pole expedition publicly, kept corresponding about it, kept his crew preparing for an Arctic drift. The men who would sail with him had no idea where they were actually going until the ship was already at sea, and Amundsen gathered them on deck at Madeira, off the coast of Africa, in September 1910, and told them the truth. He gave them the option to leave. None of them did. Before that moment, he had sent one brief telegram. It went to Robert Falcon Scott, who was already in the middle of organising his own Antarctic expedition. The telegram read, "Beg leave to inform you Fram proceeding Antarctic." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no elaboration. Just a statement of fact, delivered from a distance with the minimum number of words required to make his intentions technically known. The audacity of that telegram is hard to overstate. It was not quite a declaration of war, but it was not exactly a friendly note either. It was Amundsen announcing in the most economical terms possible that he was coming, that he was serious, and that the race Scott had not known he was in had just officially begun. Scott received it, and, by most accounts, was genuinely shaken. He had not expected competition of this kind. Not from Norway, not from Amundsen, not arriving in a telegram from Madeira while he was still organising his ponies and his motor sledges. The reasons for Amundsen's secrecy were partly practical and partly psychological. Practically, he was worried about funding. His expedition was financed in part on the basis of the North Pole plan, and he was not certain his backers would support a southern pivot. He was also worried about the Norwegian government's reaction, since the Fram was in some sense a national vessel, and he may have been worried, in a quiet, competitive way, about giving Scott any more time than necessary to prepare for the race. But there was something else too. Amundsen did not like uncertainty in public. He did not like the exposure of plans that might fail. He preferred to announce things after they were done, or at least after they were irrevocably underway. There is a kind of pride in that, but also a kind of caution. He had spent his life preparing for things that could kill him. He understood, better than most, how many things could go wrong. And he did not want to have to explain a failure that he had announced in advance. So he kept his own counsel, sent his telegram, and turned the Fram south. By the time the world knew what he was doing, he was already well on his way. That was exactly how he wanted it. The man heading toward Antarctica in late 1910, then, was not a dreamer or a romantic. He was a professional, in the fullest sense of the word. A man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating exactly the knowledge and experience that the task required. He had wintered in Antarctica. He had navigated the Northwest Passage. He had lived with Arctic peoples and learned their methods. He had studied cold and dogs and ice and the specific ways that expeditions failed. He had prepared and prepared and prepared some more. And now he was going to the most hostile place on Earth, on a tight schedule, with a small team against a competitor who had the backing of the British Empire. He was quiet about his chances, but he was not uncertain about his preparation. And in the world Amundsen inhabited, preparation was everything. While all of this was unfolding on one side of the story, something quite different was being built on the other. Because the man waiting for that telegram in London was not someone easily dismissed, and the expedition he was assembling was not a simple one. Robert Falcon Scott had his own history with Antarctica, his own reasons for going back, and his own very particular way of thinking about what the journey was supposed to mean. Robert Falcon Scott was born in 1868 in Devonport, England, the third of 5 children in a family that was comfortable but not wealthy. He joined the Royal Navy at 13, which was not unusual for the time. The Navy was one of the more reliable payers upward for a boy of his background, and Scott was clever, disciplined, and physically capable. He moved through the ranks steadily. He was a torpedo lieutenant by his late 20s, well regarded by his superiors, the kind of officer who got things done and was noticed for it. There was nothing in his early career that pointed specifically toward the poles. He had not spent his childhood reading about Franklin. He had not conditioned himself for cold. He had not, like Amundsen, been quietly building toward one particular destination for years. His connection to Antarctica came more through opportunity and ambition than through a lifelong obsession, and that distinction matters, though it should not be overstated. When the National Antarctic Expedition was being organised in London around the turn of the century, Scott campaigned for its command. He wanted it. He lobbied for it with real determination, and in 1900 he got it. The ship was the Discovery, purpose-built for the voyage, and Scott sailed south in 1901 with a team that included a young doctor named Edward Wilson and a merchant sailor named Ernest Shackleton, among others. They spent 2 years in Antarctica, wintering on the ice, conducting scientific observations, and making a southern journey that pushed further toward the pole than anyone had gone before. Scott, Wilson and Shackleton reached roughly 82 degrees south in December 1902, which was a genuine achievement. They suffered from scurvy and exhaustion on the return, and Shackleton's health deteriorated badly enough that he was sent home early, a decision that created a complicated tension between the two men that lasted for years. But the Discovery expedition was considered a success. Scott came home to considerable public recognition. He was promoted, decorated, and celebrated in the particular way that Edwardian Britain celebrated its explorers, which is to say, enthusiastically, and with a strong undercurrent of national pride. He became, in the eyes of the British public, something close to a hero. That reputation carried weight, and it also carried pressure. By 1909, when the North Pole claims were filling the newspapers, and Amundsen was quietly rethinking his plans, Scott had already been considering a return to Antarctica. He wanted the South Pole. He had been close enough in 1902 to understand what it would take, and he had spent the intervening years in the Navy, rising to captain, watching the polar world shift around him. Shackleton had gone back south with his own expedition in 1907 and had reached 88 degrees 23 minutes south, within 97 miles of the pole, before turning back due to starvation. That journey was extraordinary, and Scott admired it, but it also meant that the prize was still unclaimed, and the route was now partially known. The Terra Nova expedition, as Scott's second Antarctic venture came to be called, was announced formally in 1909. It was a large, complex undertaking, larger and more expensive than Amundsen's, and with a broader scientific mandate. Scott was not just going to plant a flag. He wanted geological samples, meteorological data, biological specimens, magnetic readings. The science was genuine and important to him, and to the scientist he brought. Edward Wilson, who'd been on the Discovery, came back as Chief of Scientific Staff. He was a calm, deeply principled man. a doctor and naturalist who was also one of Scott's closest friends. Henry Robertson Bowers, known as Birdie, was a Royal Indian Marine officer, compact, extraordinarily tough, and relentlessly cheerful in conditions that broke other men. Lawrence Oates was a cavalry officer who had bought his place on the expedition for £1,000 and had more experience with horses than with ice, which was relevant because Scott planned to use Manchurian ponies as a key part of his transport system. Edgar Evans was a Welsh petty officer, physically powerful, experienced from the Discovery expedition, and trusted by Scott personally. The transport plan was, to put it gently, complicated. Scott intended to use a combination of motor sledges, ponies, dogs, and ultimately men hauling their own sledges. The motor sledges were a new technology, motorised tracked vehicles that had never been used in polar conditions at this scale. The ponies were borrowed from a strategy that Shackleton had used with partial success, though Shackleton himself had privately concluded that dogs were probably superior. The dogs were there too, but Scott's team had limited experience with dog driving, and Scott himself was not convinced that dogs were the right primary tool. His reasoning was not entirely irrational. Dog driving at the level Amundsen practiced it was a specialised skill that took years to develop. A poorly handled dog team could be slower and more chaotic than men pulling a sledge. Scott had seen this in 1902, when his own dog driving had been inefficient and the animals had suffered. What he had not seen, and perhaps could not fully imagine, was what expert dog driving looked like. The kind Amundsen's Norwegians had grown up doing. The kind that could cover 30 miles in a day with a driver barely breaking a sweat. There was also the matter of skis. Scott's team had skis, and some of the men could use them reasonably well. But skiing was not embedded in their culture the way it was for Norwegians. Amundsen's men had been on skis since childhood. They moved on snow the way most people move on pavement, without thinking about it, without effort, as a natural extension of their bodies. Scott's men were competent, some of them quite good, but there is a difference between competent and native, and on a surface as demanding as Antarctic snow that difference shows. None of this was hidden or secret. Scott knew his team had less dog experience than Amundsen's. He knew the motor sledges were experimental. He knew the ponies were a risk. He made his choices deliberately, for reasons that made sense within his framework, and he was not a foolish man. He was experienced, organised, and genuinely brave. He had also inherited a certain set of assumptions about how polar exploration should look, assumptions shaped by the British naval tradition, by the cultural value placed on human endurance and willpower, by a sense that the right way to earn a great achievement was through suffering and effort, rather than through mechanical efficiency. There is a famous phrase associated with this period of British polar exploration, the idea that man-hauling, men dragging sledges by their own bodies, was somehow more honourable than using dogs. Whether Scott fully believed this is debated, but the attitude existed in the culture around him, and it shaped decisions in ways that are hard to fully separate from the practical ones. What is clear is that Scott was not racing in quite the same spirit as Amundsen. He was not indifferent to being first. He wanted the pole, and he wanted it for Britain, and he understood what it would mean to arrive second. But the expedition was also genuinely scientific in its ambitions, and Scott carried that weight alongside the geographic one. He was trying to do two things at once, and both of them were real to him. His team sailed south on the Terra Nova in June 1910, arriving in Antarctica and establishing their base at Cape Evans on Ross Island in January 1911. Cape Evans was a solid, practical location, close to where Discovery had wintered, familiar in some ways, with access to the Ross Ice Shelf and the route south that Shackleton had pioneered. The base hut was well built and well supplied. The men settled in for the winter with their scientific work, their preparations, and the knowledge that somewhere on the other side of the continent, the Norwegians were doing the same. Amundsen's telegram had reached Scott before he left England, and the news had spread through the expedition. The men knew they were in a race. Some of them took it hard. Others were more philosophical about it. Scott himself was measured in his public response, though his private feelings were more complicated. He had not expected this. He had not prepared for a competitor, and the competitor who had appeared was not some amateur adventurer, but one of the most experienced polar travellers alive, with a team of expert Norwegians, a faster ship, and a starting point that was, as Scott now understood, 60 miles closer to the pole. That distance, 60 miles, was not trivial. The Bay of Whales, where Amundsen had established Framheim, sat further south on the Ross Ice Shelf than Cape Evans. It was a geographic accident, a quirk of where the ice shelf happened to reach its southernmost point, but in a race measured in days and miles, 60 miles was meaningful. It meant 60 miles less to travel in each direction, which added up to roughly 120 miles less for the entire journey. At the pace these expeditions moved, that could be a week or more. Scott was aware of this, he noted it. And then he got on with his preparations because there was nothing else to do. The base was established, the depots needed to be laid, the scientific work needed to begin, and the winter was coming. Whatever Amundsen was doing on his side of the ice shelf, Scott had his own expedition to run. The two men spent the Antarctic winter of 1911, which runs from roughly April through August, preparing for the spring push south. They were separated by hundreds of miles of ice and had no communication with each other. Each knew the other was there. Each had their own system, their own timeline, their own plan. And when the polar spring arrived and the sun returned and the temperatures began, very slowly, to climb back towards something survivable, both expeditions would begin moving toward the same point on the Earth's surface. One of them would get there first, and what happened after that for both of them would depend on decisions that had already been made, preparations that had already been completed or not completed, and the particular cruelties of a place that does not negotiate with anyone, regardless of their nationality, their reputation, or the weight of the expectations they carry south with them. The story of how those preparations actually unfolded, the depot laying, the setbacks, the tensions within each camp, is where the real character of both expeditions begins to reveal itself. Robert Falcon Scott was born in 1868 in Devonport, a naval town on the southwestern coast of England, and from a fairly early age his life was pointed in one direction. The Royal Navy was not just a career for men like Scott, it was a world, a culture, a complete system of values and expectations that shaped how you thought, how you carried yourself, how you made decisions, and what you believed you owed to the people watching you. He entered the Navy as a young man, moved steadily through its ranks, and by the time he was in his early 30s he had the bearing and the record of someone going somewhere. He was disciplined, intelligent, and capable. He was also not especially experienced in cold weather survival, which turned out to matter quite a lot. His first encounter with Antarctica came in 1901, when he commanded the Discovery Expedition, a joint effort organised by the Royal Geographical Society and the Royal Society to conduct scientific research in the southern continent. The Discovery sailed south with a crew that included a young doctor named Edward Wilson, who had become one of Scott's closest friends, and Ernest Shackleton, who had his own complicated future ahead of him. The expedition wintered at McMurdo Sound, conducted geological surveys, studied the ice, took meteorological readings, and pushed south across the Ross Ice Shelf to a then record latitude of 82 degrees 17 minutes south. It was not a failure. It was, by most measures, a genuine achievement, and it returned Scott to England as something of a public figure, the man who had gone further south than anyone before him. Britain received him warmly. He was promoted, decorated, and celebrated in the particular way that Edwardian England celebrated its explorers, with dinners, lectures, newspaper profiles, and a general sense that here was a man who embodied the national character at its best. Brave, steady, dutiful, not given to boasting. The kind of man who went into difficult places and came back with knowledge and credit for the country. Scott was not entirely comfortable with this attention. But he understood it, and he did not resist it. The expectations that came with it, though, those were harder to set aside. By 1909, he was already planning to return to Antarctica. The South Pole had not yet been reached, and the question of who would reach it first had become one of the most talked about geographic questions of the age. Scott was the obvious British candidate. He had the experience, the reputation, and the institutional support. The Terra Nova expedition was announced. Funding was assembled from a combination of government grants and private donations, and the planning began in earnest. The goal was clear: reach the South Pole and return alive. What is worth understanding about Scott's expedition is that it was not designed as a simple race. That framing came later, partly because of what happened, and partly because Amundsen's arrival in the picture forced it. But when Scott was putting the Terra Nova expedition together, he was thinking about it as something larger than a sprint to a coordinate. He wanted to conduct real science: geology, meteorology, biology, glaciology. He wanted to bring back specimens and data that would matter to researchers for years. The pole was the centerpiece, the headline, the thing that would justify the cost and the risk in the eyes of the public. But the scientific work was not window dressing. Scott and his team, particularly Edward Wilson, genuinely cared about it. This is worth saying plainly because Scott is sometimes remembered only through the lens of his tragic end, and that lens can flatten a complicated man into a cautionary symbol. He was more than that. He was a serious expedition leader with real scientific goals, real organisational skill, and a team that included some of the most capable people in British polar exploration at the time. Edward Wilson was a physician and naturalist, mild-mannered, deeply religious, and possessed of an almost serene steadiness that made him invaluable in difficult situations. He and Scott had a bond that went beyond professional respect. Wilson was the kind of person you wanted next to you when things went wrong, which says something about Scott's judgment in choosing him. Lawrence Oates was a cavalry officer, a man from a completely different military tradition than Scott's naval background, and someone who had purchased his place on the expedition. Literally bought himself a spot which was not unusual at the time. He was blunt, occasionally sardonic, and extraordinarily tough. His experience with horses made him the natural choice to manage the Siberian ponies that Scott had decided to bring as part of his transport plan. Edgar Evans was a petty officer from the Royal Navy, physically powerful and highly experienced in Antarctic conditions from the Discovery expedition. He was Welsh, and by several accounts enormously capable with his hands, good at repairing equipment, managing loads, and the kind of practical physical work that keeps an expedition functioning. Henry Bowers, known as Birdie for reasons that become obvious when you see photographs of him, was a Royal Indian Marine officer, compact and almost absurdly hardy. He barely seemed to feel cold in the way other men did. He was meticulous, energetic, and deeply organised. Bowers would prove to be one of the most quietly remarkable members of the entire expedition. These were the men who would eventually form the five-man Polar Party. But in the early months of 1911, they were still at Cape Evans, preparing for the winter and the push south, and the full composition of the final group had not yet been decided. Scott's transport plan was genuinely complicated, and it is worth spending a moment on it because it shaped everything that followed. He had 3 types of transport: motor sledges, ponies, and dogs. The motor sledges were an experiment, 2-tracked vehicles designed to haul heavy loads across the ice shelf. They were the most modern technology available, and Scott believed in them, or at least believed in the idea of them. The ponies were meant to carry supplies across the flat ice shelf before being shot and used as food at the base of the mountains. The dogs would assist but were not central to the plan in the way Amundsen's dogs were central to his, and ultimately, the final push to the pole would be made by men hauling sledges on their own bodies. This plan had a logic to it. The motor sledges would handle the heaviest early loads. The ponies would extend that capacity across the shelf. The dogs would provide additional pulling, and the men, fit and well supplied by the time they reached the mountains, would complete the journey under their own power. Each element was meant to support the others in sequence. The problem was that the elements were not equally reliable, and the plan left very little room for any of them to fail. The motor sledges, as it turned out, were fragile. One fell through sea ice during unloading before the expedition even properly began. The other two managed to travel only a short distance onto the ice shelf before their engines failed in the cold. They were abandoned early, having contributed almost nothing to the transport plan. The ponies were better, but they suffered badly in the Antarctic conditions. Their hooves were not suited to the surface. They sweated through their coats and then froze, and they required large quantities of food that had to be carried along. Several died before the journey south even started. The dogs were effective, but Scott's men were not skilled enough with them to use them at anything close to their potential. None of these problems were invisible to Scott. He was aware of the risks he was taking with each element of the plan, but he had committed to a system, and changing it fundamentally at this stage was not really possible. The expedition was already in Antarctica, the winter was passing, and the southern journey would begin in the spring, whether the transport plan was perfect or not. The depot-laying journey in January and February of 1911 gave the first real indication of how the ponies would perform. The team travelled south to lay food and fuel caches that the returning polar party would depend on, and the ponies struggled. The surface was often soft, the animals sank into the snow, and the cold was harder on them than Scott had hoped. The furthest depot, which became known as 1 Ton Depot, was laid at 79 degrees 29 minutes south, rather than the intended 80 degrees south. That shortfall of roughly 35 miles was a decision made to spare the ponies, and it was a decision that would carry consequences none of them could yet see. The winter months at Cape Evans were not merely waiting. The men worked, studied, collected specimens from the sea ice, made observations, and prepared their equipment with the kind of careful attention that serious expeditions require. There were lectures in the evenings, there was cooking and conversation. There was the particular intimacy that comes from a small group of people sharing a confined space through months of polar darkness. Scott kept a detailed journal. Wilson painted watercolours. Bowers organised supply lists with the thoroughness of a man who genuinely enjoyed organising supply lists, and through all of it, the knowledge of Amundsen's presence sat in the background. The Norwegians were out there somewhere, on the other side of the shelf, doing their own preparing. Nobody at Cape Evans knew exactly what Amundsen was planning or how far along he was. They knew he was there. They knew he was experienced. They knew his team were dog experts and expert skiers. And they knew that come spring, both expeditions would start moving south at roughly the same time. Some of Scott's men were more bothered by this than others. Oates, in private letters, expressed concern about the ponies and the transport plan in terms that were fairly direct. He did not think the ponies were good enough, and he said so, though not in ways that changed the plan. Wilson, characteristically, was calmer about it, not indifferent, but less consumed by the competitive dimension. Scott himself was somewhere in between, aware of the race, not paralysed by it, but unable to fully put it aside. What is striking, looking back, is how much Scott was trying to hold together at once. The science, the logistics, the transport plan, the morale of his team, the expectations of Britain, and now the presence of a competitor who had arrived uninvited and set up camp 60 miles closer to the destination. Any one of those things alone would be a significant weight. Carrying all of them through an Antarctic winter, with the southern journey still ahead, required a particular kind of steadiness. Scott had that steadiness. Whether it would be enough was a question the spring would answer. The ponies were fed and rested through the dark months. The sledges were repacked and reweighed. The rations were calculated, checked and checked again. The route south, across the ice shelf, up through the Transantarctic Mountains via the Beardmore Glacier and onto the polar plateau, had been partially pioneered by Shackleton in 1908 and 1909, which gave Scott at least a known path to follow, a real advantage over Amundsen, who was approaching the mountains from a different direction and had no idea what he would find. Scott's route was harder in some ways, longer in others, but it was not a complete unknown. And so, as the Antarctic spring of 1911 began to arrive and the sun returned, and the temperatures crept upward from their winter depths, both camps prepared to move. The race that neither man had originally planned to run was about to begin in earnest. What the ice shelf would do with them, what the mountains would demand, and what the plateau would take, all of that still lay ahead, unwritten, waiting. While Scott's men were making their final preparations at Cape Evans, on the other side of the Ross Ice Shelf, Amundsen had been busy in a way that was almost unsettling in its thoroughness. His base, which the team named Framheim, meaning Fram's home, had been established in February of 1911 at the Bay of Whales, a natural indentation in the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf where the ice meets the open sea. The Bay of Whales was not a random choice. Amundsen had studied the maps and the accounts of earlier expeditions carefully, and he understood that this location sat roughly 60 miles closer to the South Pole than Scott's position at Cape Evans. 60 miles might not sound like much on a map of Antarctica, but on foot, in cold that makes every mile feel earned, 60 miles is a meaningful number. It was the kind of advantage a careful planner builds in before the journey even starts. The ice shelf itself was Amundsen's starting platform, and it was an extraordinary thing to be standing on. The Ross Ice Shelf is the largest floating body of ice on Earth, roughly the size of France, a vast flat plain of ancient compressed snow, hundreds of meters thick, extending inland from the sea. It moves slowly, always, grinding toward the ocean at a pace too slow to feel but too real to ignore. Framheim was built directly on top of it, a cluster of prefabricated wooden huts half buried in the snow for insulation, connected by tunnels with storage rooms and workshops carved into the ice below. By the time the polar winter set in, the men had transformed it into something genuinely functional. There were 19 men at Framheim in total, and they spent those winter months doing what Amundsen did with every available hour, preparing. The key figures in Amundsen's team were not famous men when they left Norway, but they were skilled. Olav Bjaaland was a champion skier and carpenter from Telemark, quiet and precise. Helmer Hansen was an experienced ice driver who had travelled with Amundsen on the Northwest Passage, one of the best dog handlers on the expedition. Sverre Hassel had worked in the Arctic and knew sled dogs well. Oscar Wisting was a naval gunner with a calm, steady temperament, and Hjalmar Johansson was perhaps the most experienced polar traveller of all. He had survived a 460-mile man-hauling journey across the Arctic with Fridtjof Nansen in 1895, reaching a latitude record that stood for years. These were not men assembled for their ability to give speeches at dinner parties. They were chosen because they could do specific, difficult things in extreme conditions. Before the winter even properly closed in, Amundsen had organised a series of depot-laying journeys south across the ice shelf. Between February and April of 1911, the team made 3 major journeys, establishing supply caches at 80 degrees south, 81 degrees south, and 82 degrees south. The total weight of supplies deposited was approximately 3 tons. Food, fuel, and equipment placed at precise intervals so that the returning polar party would never have to travel more than a manageable distance between resupply points. The depots were marked carefully, not just with a single flag but with lines of flags extending east and west from the central cache, so that even if the returning men drifted slightly off course in a whiteout, they would still intersect the marker line somewhere. This kind of redundancy was characteristic of how Amundsen thought. He did not trust a single point of failure when he could build in a backup. The winter passed in a focused quiet. The men worked on their equipment constantly. Bjaaland, the carpenter, reduced the weight of the sledges significantly by shaving down unnecessary wood. The sledges that left Norway weighing around 83 pounds arrived at the pole weighing closer to 48. The bindings on the skis were adjusted and readjusted. The dogs were fed and exercised and observed. Amundsen himself was not a man who spent a lot of time in long philosophical reflection, at least not publicly. He was a planner, and planning was how he managed the anxiety of waiting. Then came September. The Antarctic spring technically begins around September, when the sun returns and temperatures begin their slow climb from the worst of winter. Amundsen had set September 8th, 1911 as the date for departure. He was eager to get moving, eager to be first, and the calendar told him the season had begun. What the thermometer told him on that morning was something different. The temperature on September 8th was approximately minus 56 degrees Celsius. That is a number that's difficult to make feel real from a warm room, so it helps to think about it in terms of what it does to a body. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Exhaled breath freezes before it fully leaves the mouth. Metal becomes brittle. Lubricants in mechanical equipment fail. Dogs, even Antarctic hardened sled dogs, suffer badly. The cold on September 8th was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous in a way that could end the expedition before it properly began. Amundsen pressed on anyway. The party set out south across the ice shelf, and almost immediately things began to go wrong. The dogs struggled. Several of the men began showing signs of frostbite within the first day. The cold was simply too severe for the pace Amundsen had planned. After a short distance, the decision was made to push on to the first depot at 80 degrees south, leave the supplies there, and then reassess. They reached the depot, but the conditions did not improve. The cold was relentless. Some of the men were suffering genuinely, not just from discomfort, but from the kind of cold injury that could cost fingers or toes if it was pushed further. On September 12th, Amundsen ordered a retreat back to Framheim. The return was chaotic and frankly a little embarrassing. The men drove the dogs hard to get back to the warmth of the base, and the journey home became a near rout. Men riding sledges at full speed, some of them suffering from frostbite, arriving back at Framheim in poor condition. It was not the orderly, controlled retreat of a confident expedition. It was a scramble. And then came the moment that nearly fractured the whole enterprise. Hjalmar Johansen, the most experienced polar traveller in the group, was furious. He had been left behind during the final dash to the base. Amundsen and some of the others had pushed ahead in the cold, leaving two men, Johansen and Adolf Lindström, to manage on their own. Johansen was not a man who swallowed his feelings quietly, and that evening at Framheim he said in front of the other men that what had happened was not an expedition. It was every man for himself. He criticised Amundsen directly and openly. The accusation had some justice to it. Amundsen had, in the chaos of the retreat, not ensured that all his men were together and accounted for. Johansen's anger was real, and not entirely unfair. What happened next tells you something important about Amundsen. He did not argue with Johansen publicly. He did not dismiss the criticism or make a scene of it. He listened, he absorbed it, and then he made a decision that was cold in a different way than the temperature outside. Johansen was removed from the polar party. He would not be among the men who went to the pole. He was assigned instead to lead a secondary journey to explore King Edward VII's land, a geographic task but not the one that mattered. It was effectively a demotion dressed as a reassignment. This was not a small thing. Johansen was arguably the most experienced man at Framheim, and excluding him from the polar attempt on the basis of a public disagreement had a certain ruthlessness to it that Amundsen never quite explained away in later accounts. Some of the other men were uncomfortable with the decision. The atmosphere at Framheim in the weeks that followed was not entirely easy, but Amundsen had made his choice, and he did not reverse it. The authority of the expedition leader was not something he was willing to put up for discussion. The false start had cost them time and some morale, but it had also taught them something. The cold of the early September was genuinely too severe for safe travel. Amundsen revised his departure date, pushing it to mid-October, when the temperatures would be higher, still extreme by any normal standard, but manageable for men and dogs who were well prepared. The extra weeks at Framheim were spent in additional preparation, adjusting equipment, feeding the dogs, and waiting with the particular patience that experienced polar travellers develop out of necessity rather than preference. By the time October arrived, the temperature had risen to the point where travel was possible, without the risk of immediate frostbite in normal conditions. The dogs were in good shape. The sledges had been refined to their lightest practical configuration. The depot sat waiting at 80 degrees, 81 degrees, and 82 degrees south, stocked with supplies that the returning men would need. The route ahead, across the flat shelf and then up into the unknown mountains, was still largely unmapped from Amundsen's direction of approach. But the preparation that could be done had been done. There is something worth pausing on here before the journey south begins in earnest. The false start of September 8th is sometimes treated as a footnote, a minor setback before the real story. But it was more than that. It revealed something about the pressure Amundsen was operating under, even with all his careful preparation. He had pushed the departure date too early, driven partly by the anxiety of the race, by the knowledge that Scott was on the other side of the shelf and that every day mattered. The man who prided himself on patience had let urgency override judgment just once, and it had nearly cost him. The correction he made afterward, adjusting the date, reorganising the party, holding his nerve through the Johansen episode, was itself a kind of recovery. A quieter demonstration of what he was capable of. The tension at Framheim after the false start was real, but it did not last in the way that destructive tensions do. The men had work to occupy them, and work, in Amundsen's world, was always the answer to anxiety. The dogs were exercised and fed. The equipment was checked one more time. The rations were packed with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Every calorie accounted for, every depot marked on the map, every contingency considered as far as it could be considered from the warmth of a hut on the edge of the world's largest ice shelf. And then October came, and the waiting was over. On the 19th of October 1911, 5 men walked out of Framheim and pointed themselves south. Amundsen had chosen his polar party carefully, and the 5 he selected were not the most famous or the most senior men at the base. They were the most capable for this specific task. Olav Bjarland was a champion skier from Telemark, one of the best in Norway, a man who could cover ground on skis the way other people cover ground walking. Helmer Hansen was a dog driver of exceptional skill, someone who had travelled with Amundsen before and who understood sled dogs the way a good horseman understands horses. Intuitively, patiently, with an authority that the animals seemed to recognise. Sverre Hassel had experience in the Arctic and was another strong dog handler. Oscar Wisting was steady, practical and physically tough, the kind of man who simply kept going when other men found reasons to slow down. And Amundsen himself, 40 years old, lean from months of preparation, carrying the quiet weight of everything he had planned and risked to get to this moment. They left with 4 sledges and 52 dogs, not 1 or 2 dogs pulling a light load, but 52 animals, a serious working team, loud and difficult to manage at the start of a journey when the dogs were fresh and full of energy. Anyone who has worked with sled dogs knows that the beginning of a long run is often the hardest part to control. The animals want to go. They pull against each other, tangle their lines and surge forward with a kind of joyful violence that requires real skill to direct. On the morning of October 19th, with the cold air around them and the flat white of the Ross ice shelf stretching out ahead, those 52 dogs must have made a considerable amount of noise. The Ross ice shelf is hard to describe in a way that does it justice. It is roughly the size of France. It is flat in the way that something enormous is flat, not perfectly smooth but featureless enough that after a few hours of travel you begin to lose any sense of having moved at all. The horizon looks the same in every direction. The light on clear days comes from above and reflects back from below, so that the world becomes a kind of white sphere with no clear edges. Shadows behave strangely. Distances are impossible to judge. A pressure ridge that looks like a small bump from a distance turns out to be a wall of ice 10 feet high. A dark shape on the horizon that might be a mountain might also be a cloud or nothing at all. just the eye trying to find something to hold on to. The men travelled in this environment for weeks. Day after day, the same whiteness, the same horizon, the same sound of runners on snow and dogs breathing hard. Amundsen wrote in his diary that the monotony of the shelf was its own kind of challenge, not dangerous in the obvious way, but wearing on the mind in a quieter way. You had to stay focused on your compass bearing and your pace count, because there was nothing external to anchor your position. The shelf did not care whether you drifted a few degrees east or west. It looked identical in every direction. They were covering roughly 20 to 30 miles per day. This was not a desperate, exhausted pace. It was a steady, sustainable rhythm that Amundsen had planned carefully. He did not want to arrive at the mountains with men and dogs already spent. The depot system he had laid earlier in the year made this possible. At 80 degrees south, there was food and fuel waiting. At 81 degrees south, more supplies. At 82 degrees south, another cache. The men did not need to carry everything from the start, which meant the sledges were lighter, which meant the dogs worked less hard, which meant everyone arrived at the next depot in better condition. It was a self-reinforcing system, and it worked almost exactly as designed. The psychological experience of those early weeks is worth dwelling on for a moment. There is something particular about travelling through a completely featureless landscape, under your own power, day after day, with no external news, no contact with the outside world, and only 4 other people for company. The world shrinks to the size of your immediate surroundings. The sledge in front of you, the dogs ahead of that, the man on skis to your left. Conversations happen at camp, in the tent at night over food. During the day, everyone is mostly focused on the work of moving forward. There is a kind of enforced simplicity to it that some people find meditative and others find maddening. Amundsen's men seem to have handled it well. They were not a group prone to philosophical crisis. By mid-November, the flat shelf was behind them, and something had appeared on the horizon that was not a cloud, and was not a mirage. The Transantarctic mountains rose ahead of them like a wall, dark rock and white ice, enormous and sharp-edged against the sky. This was the edge of the known world, at least from Amundsen's direction of approach. No one had ever crossed these mountains from the Ross ice shelf side heading toward the polar plateau. The British expeditions had found a route up through the Beardmore Glacier further east. Amundsen had chosen a different line entirely, one that no one had scouted, one that existed on his map only as a blank space marked with question marks. He had seen the mountains from a distance during the depot-laying journeys earlier in the year, and he had identified a possible glacier route, a line of ice pushing down through the peaks that might, if they were fortunate, provide a passable route upward. He had named it the Axel Heiberg Glacier, after a Norwegian patron who had helped fund the expedition. But naming something is not the same as knowing it. The glacier was named from a distance, from a brief glimpse during a previous journey. What it actually looked like up close, whether it was passable with loaded sledges and 52 dogs, whether it would take them up or stop them entirely, none of that was known. Standing at the foot of those mountains after weeks of flat, featureless travel, looking up at the glacier for the first time, must have been one of the stranger moments of the journey. The shelf had been monotonous and disorienting in its blankness. The mountains were the opposite, vivid, dramatic, immediate, and completely unknown. After all the planning, all the preparation, all the careful management of supplies and dogs and men, they had arrived at the part of the journey where the map ran out. The question of what lay ahead was not just geographic, it was physical. The glacier would need to be climbed with loaded sledges and 52 dogs over terrain that no one had assessed. The surface might be smooth enough to manage, or it might be broken and crevassed in ways that made progress impossible. The angle might be workable, or it might be too steep for the sledges. There was no way to know until they tried, and there was, of course, no going back, not in any practical sense. The depot system pointed south. The plan pointed south. The entire logic of the expedition pointed south. forward was the only direction that made sense. Amundsen camped at the foot of the mountains on November 16, 1911. He looked up at the glacier and wrote in his diary that it appeared promising. That is a very Amundsen sentence. Not dramatic, not emotional, not full of the romantic language that Victorian explorers used when confronting the sublime. Promising. As if he were appraising a piece of equipment or a weather forecast. The men spent the evening in camp preparing for the climb. The dogs were fed well. The sledges were checked. The route ahead was studied as carefully as it could be from below. And then, the next morning, they began to go up. What happened over the following 4 days on the Axel Heiberg Glacier was, by any measure, one of the most physically demanding parts of the entire journey. But that is the story of the climb itself, and it deserves its own telling. What matters here, at the end of those first weeks across the shelf, is what the departure from Framheim on October 19th had actually set in motion. 5 men and 52 dogs travelling south across a continent-sized sheet of ice, carrying food and fuel and the weight of a plan that had been years in the making. No motor sledges, no ponies, no large supporting party, just the 5 of them, and the dogs, and the depots, and the compass bearing. The shelf had been crossed. The mountains were ahead. The unknown was no longer abstract. It was right there, enormous, and dark, and covered in ice, waiting to be either climbed or to stop them where they stood. Amundsen had managed the first phase of the journey exactly as he had intended. The dogs were in good condition. The men were healthy. The supplies had been where they were supposed to be. The system had held, but the system had been designed for the flat ice. What came next was something different entirely. A 4-day climb up a glacier no one had ever ascended, into an elevation and a cold that the shelf had not prepared them for, toward a polar plateau that was still hundreds of miles from the point on the map that had been driving all of this since the moment Amundsen had pivoted his entire expedition south and sent that brief, audacious telegram from Madeira. The shelf was behind them now. The mountains were in front. And somewhere above those mountains, if the glacier held, was the plateau. And beyond the plateau was the pole, and between here and there was terrain that existed, for Amundsen and his 4 companions, only in the form of whatever they were about to discover. They started up on the morning of November the 17th, 1911. The Axel Heiberg Glacier rises from the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf in a way that is difficult to describe without making it sound either manageable or impossible. And the truth is that it was both at different moments during those 4 days. The glacier is roughly 40 miles long from its foot to the polar plateau above, and it gains something close to 10,000 feet in elevation over that distance. That is not a gentle slope. In places the surface was relatively smooth, packed hard by wind and cold, and the sledges moved reasonably well. In other places the ice fractured into pressure ridges and crevasse fields that forced the men to pick their route carefully, sometimes stopping to probe ahead with ski poles before committing the dogs and the loaded sledges to a section of ground that might or might not hold. The dogs were extraordinary on that climb. This is worth saying plainly, because so much of what made Amundsen's expedition work came down to the dogs, and the glacier was where that became most obvious. 52 dogs pulling 4 loaded sledges up a steep broken glacier in Antarctic cold. It sounds like something that should not work, and yet it did, because the dogs Amundsen had chosen were Greenland huskies, bred for exactly this kind of work. They had been trained and conditioned across the months at Framheim and during the depot-laying journeys. They were strong and experienced. They knew how to work in harness on difficult terrain. Still, difficult is difficult. The men used crampons on the steeper sections, the metal spikes biting into the ice and giving them purchase where otherwise they would have slipped. When the sledges stalled on a particularly steep pitch, the men put their own weight into it alongside the dogs, pushing from behind, hauling on the traces, using everything available to keep the momentum going. Helmer Hansen, who drove the lead sledge and was widely considered the best dog handler on the team, was often out in front reading the terrain, choosing the line, keeping his team moving with the combination of voice commands, encouragement, and the long whip that Antarctic sledge drivers use not always to strike the dogs but to direct them, to signal, to maintain the rhythm of the team. There was a craft to it. Hansen had that craft in a way that was almost instinctive. Amundsen described the glacier in his diary with his characteristic precision. He noted the angle of the slopes, the condition of the surface, the behaviour of the dogs, the distances covered each day. What comes through even in his careful, practical language is a sense of controlled intensity. Every day on the glacier was a problem to be solved. The route was never obvious. The surface changed without warning. A section that had looked manageable from below turned out to be broken and chaotic up close, and they had to find a way around it or through it. A section that had looked impassable from a distance turned out to have a workable line if they angled slightly to the left or picked their way between two particular pressure ridges. On the third day, November 19th, they hit the worst of it. The upper section of the glacier, as they approached the plateau, became a maze of ice blocks and crevasses that Amundsen later described as a chaos of ice. The sledges had to be unloaded and the loads carried separately across sections too broken to risk the full weight. The dogs were guided through individually on some of the worst stretches. It was slow, exhausting work at altitude, in cold that was now considerably sharper than it had been on the shelf below, but they got through it. By the evening of November 20th, after 4 days of climbing, all 5 men and all 52 dogs stood on the polar plateau. The elevation up there is roughly 10,500 feet. The plateau is not a mountain peak in the conventional sense. It is a vast, elevated plain of ice and snow that covers most of the Antarctic interior, and standing on it for the first time you would have no sense of having climbed to a summit. There is no dramatic view downward, no sense of height in the way a mountain summit gives you. There is just more ice stretching in every direction, flat and featureless, the sky enormous above it. The wind, at that elevation, is a different kind of cold than the shelf. It cuts through clothing in a way that feels personal. But before any of that could fully register, there was something that needed to be done. Something that Amundsen had known would need to be done, had planned for, and had been carrying with him as a practical necessity since the expedition was being organised. And yet knowing something is necessary does not make it easy. At a place they marked at approximately 85 degrees and 10 minutes south, just at the top of the glacier, Amundsen called a halt. They had arrived with 52 dogs. They would continue with 18. The other 24 would be killed here, at a site the men named, with a dark practicality that says something about their state of mind, the butcher's shop. The reasoning was straightforward, even if the act was not. Dogs require food. The food had to be carried. The more dogs you have beyond the polar plateau, the more food you need, and the more weight you're carrying up there at altitude in the cold. Amundsen had calculated from the beginning that the dogs who had done the hardest work getting up the glacier would be killed at the top. Their meat used to feed the surviving dogs and to supplement the men's rations. The strongest 18 dogs would continue to the pole, and if all went well, back. It was a closed system of brutal efficiency. The men did the killing themselves. It took several hours. Olaf Bjaaland, who had been a champion skier in Norway before joining the expedition, wrote in his diary that it was not a pleasant business. That is understating it considerably. These were not anonymous animals. They had names. The men had worked alongside them for months, had fed them, had driven them across the shelf and up the glacier, had watched them work through conditions that would have stopped a lesser animal entirely. Killing them was not done lightly, and the men's diaries from that evening carry a heaviness that is absent from most of the rest of the journey. Amundsen himself wrote about it with a restraint that reads, in context, more like suppression than indifference. He noted what was done, noted the practical outcome, and moved on. But the place name he chose, the butcher's shop, suggests that the grimness of it was not lost on him. The surviving 18 dogs were fed well that evening. The men ate too, the fresh meat a significant change from the pemmican, and biscuits that had made up most of their diet on the shelf. Amundsen noted that the dog meat was good. This is the kind of sentence that sits oddly on the page, but up there on the polar plateau at 10,000 feet, With hundreds of miles still to travel, calories were not an abstraction. What the 5 men had achieved in those 4 days on the glacier was genuinely significant, even apart from what came after. They had found and ascended a route through the Transantarctic mountains that no one had known existed in any practical sense. The Axel Heiberg Glacier, which Amundsen had named from a distance and approached without any reliable information about its character, had turned out to be passable. Not easy, not comfortable, not without its dangerous sections and its exhausting days, but passable. The route worked. This was not luck exactly, though some of it was. Amundsen had chosen his line across the mountains based on observation and judgment, and his judgment had been sound. But the glacier could have been impassable. It could have been too steep, too broken, too crevassed to allow loaded sledges and dogs to get through. If it had been, the expedition would have been forced to turn back and find another way, losing days they did not have. The fact that it worked was partly skill, partly preparation, and partly the kind of thing that exploration always requires. A willingness to commit to a route before you can be certain it will go. Now, they were on the plateau. 18 dogs, 5 men, 4 sledges, and still roughly 400 miles to the pole. The elevation was significant. Breathing at 10,000 feet in Antarctic cold is not the same as breathing at sea level, and the body takes time to adjust to the reduced oxygen, time that they did not really have. The temperatures up here dropped at night to levels that made the shelf feel almost mild. The wind moved differently, coming from directions that shifted without much warning, sometimes pushing them along, sometimes cutting across their path, in a way that made the cold feel focused and deliberate. But the dogs were still pulling. The men were still moving. The depot system, which had been laid with such care during the months at Framheim, was behind them now. Those southern depots at 80, 81 and 82 degrees had been used and passed. Ahead, the supplies were what they were carrying, plus whatever they could reach if they continued to make progress at the rate they had been managing on the shelf. The plateau stretched ahead of them, enormous and blank and cold. The mountains were below them now, invisible behind the curve of the ice. The shelf was even further below, somewhere beneath the glacier they had just climbed. The world had contracted to the 5 of them, and the dogs and the compass bearing, and the white in every direction. Amundsen would have been doing the mathematics constantly. Miles covered, miles remaining, food consumed, food remaining, the condition of the dogs, the condition of the men, the weather, the temperature, the angle of the sun when it was visible. He was that kind of expedition leader. Not inspiring in the traditional sense, not given to speeches or dramatic gestures, but relentlessly attentive to the practical reality of where they were and what they needed to do to keep moving. That attentiveness was, in a way, the most important thing he brought to the polar plateau. Not courage, not physical strength, though he had both. The ability to keep thinking clearly in conditions designed to prevent clear thinking. The Axel Heiberg Glacier was behind them. The butcher's shop was behind them. The mountains were below, and ahead, somewhere out across that featureless white elevation, was the polar plateau proper, and whatever it was going to do to 5 men and 18 dogs over the next several hundred miles of the most remote terrain on the surface of the Earth. They broke camp on the morning of November 21st, pointed south, and kept moving. The plateau received them without ceremony. The cold was immediate and total. The sky was the sky of Antarctica at altitude, enormous, pale, indifferent. The dogs moved in their traces, the sledges moved across the snow, and the 5 men who had just climbed 10,000 feet up a glacier no one had ever ascended moved with them into a stretch of the journey that would test them in ways the glacier, for all its difficulty, had not yet managed to do. The polar plateau is not like anything else on the surface of the Earth. That sounds like the kind of sentence people say to sound dramatic, but in this case it is simply accurate. The Ross ice shelf, which the men had crossed in the weeks before the glacier, is flat and cold and featureless, but it sits at sea level. The air there, while brutal, is at least the thickness of ordinary Antarctic air. The plateau is different. It sits at roughly 10,000 feet. and the air at that elevation in Antarctica behaves in ways that make even experienced men feel strange. The oxygen is thinner, the cold is drier. The light, when the sun is out, has a quality that is difficult to describe. Too bright, too even, coming from everywhere at once because it reflects off the snow in all directions and casts almost no shadow. On the plateau, you can look at a surface that appears completely flat and step into a hollow 3 feet deep that you simply could not see. The light hides the terrain from you. It makes the ground unreliable in a way that is deeply unsettling, because the ground is the one thing you are supposed to be able to trust. Amundsen's party moved south across this for day after day. The distances they were covering were still good, 20 to 25 miles most days, occasionally more when the surface was firm and the dogs were running well. But the plateau had its own way of wearing on people, and it was not the same as the glacier had been. The glacier had been difficult in a physical, immediate sense. Steep ice, crevasses, heavy loads, exhausted animals. The plateau was difficult in a different way. It was difficult because it was the same. Every day the same pale sky, the same white surface, the same compass bearing, the same cold. The same process of breaking camp, loading the sledges, moving south, stopping, making camp, cooking, sleeping, waking to do it again. Olaf Bjaaland, who was the expedition's best skier and whose diary is one of the more candid records of the journey, wrote at one point that the monotony was harder than the work. That is saying something, because the work was genuinely hard. The temperatures on the plateau dropped well below what they had experienced on the shelf. Minus 40 degrees Celsius was not unusual. On some nights it went lower. At those temperatures, metal behaves differently. The fittings on the sledges became brittle. The dogs' paws needed careful attention. The men's faces, despite the protection of their finnesko boots and their layered wool and their windproof outer garments, were constantly at risk. Frostbite on the plateau was not a dramatic event. It was a quiet, persistent threat that required daily vigilance. A patch of white skin on a cheek. A fingertip that had gone numb without the person noticing. The men checked each other regularly, the way you might check a campfire. Not with alarm, just with steady attention, because letting it go unnoticed was how you lost something permanently. Then, around the 86th parallel, the plateau stopped being flat. This stretch is sometimes called the Devil's Glacier in accounts of the journey, though Amundsen used slightly different terminology in his own writing. Whatever you call it, it was a zone of pressure ice, a chaotic, broken section of the plateau where the ice had been forced into ridges and hummocks and crevasses by the slow, immense movement of the polar ice sheet meeting resistance from the terrain beneath. It looked by some accounts like a frozen sea caught mid-storm. Ridges of ice 3 and 4 feet high running in irregular lines, gaps between them that could swallow a sledge runner or a dog's leg, snow bridges over crevasses that looked solid and were not. Navigation through it required the men to be on foot, probing ahead, choosing lines, sometimes physically lifting the sledges over obstacles that the dogs could not pull them across. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of picking through broken terrain at altitude, cold, in the kind of flat light that made it nearly impossible to judge depth or distance. Amundsen later described it as the most technically demanding section of the entire journey, which is a remarkable thing to say given what they had already been through on the glacier. The dogs struggled here in a different way than they had on the glacier. On the glacier the problem had been the steepness and the weight. Here the problem was the footing, irregular, unpredictable, full of small hazards that could injure an animal in an instant. Several of the dogs took falls. None were seriously hurt, but the anxiety of watching them move through that terrain was its own kind of exhaustion. Helmer Hansen, who drove the lead sledge and whose skill with dogs was probably the finest of the 5 men, worked almost continuously during those 3 days. He had a way of reading the dogs and reading the surface simultaneously that the others admired openly. Bjaaland, who was faster on skis and often ranged ahead to scout the route, would come back and describe what he had seen, and Hansen would adjust the line accordingly. It was a good working system. The skier as scout, the the dog driver as navigator, Amundsen watching the compass and making the final calls. Oscar Wisting and Severa Hassel managed the other sledges, and their job during the Devil's Glacier section was essentially to keep up and keep the loads from shifting on the uneven ground. It was unglamorous work. It was also essential. When they finally came through the broken ice and onto smoother surface again, somewhere around 87 degrees south, the relief was physical. Bjaaland wrote about it plainly. The ground was good again, the dogs were moving well, and everything felt more possible than it had for 3 days. That is not a small thing to feel when you're still more than 200 miles from your destination and the temperature is sitting at -35. The physical toll of the plateau crossing was accumulating in ways that the men did not always acknowledge directly in their diaries. Altitude affects the body over time, even when the body's adapting. Sleep at altitude is often less restorative than sleep at sea level. Appetite can decrease, which is dangerous when you are burning the kind of calories that extreme cold and physical labour require. Amundsen had planned the rations carefully, more carefully than almost any previous polar expedition, but the plateau was testing those calculations. The men were eating well by the standards of Antarctic exploration, but well by those standards still meant a body under significant sustained stress. Frostbite had left its marks on several of them. Hansen had some damage to his fingers. Wisting had patches on his face that had gone white and then recovered, but left the skin tender. None of them were incapacitated, and none of the injuries were of the kind that would compromise the journey. But they were reminders that the plateau was not simply a long flat walk. It was a long flat walk at the edge of what the human body can maintain without permanent cost. Navigation on the plateau was one of Amundsen's quiet preoccupations throughout this section of the journey. There were no landmarks, literally none. In every direction, in every degree of the compass, the view was the same. White surface, pale sky, the horizon, a line that seemed to exist more as a concept than as a real boundary between two things. Without landmarks, navigation depended entirely on the compass and on dead reckoning. The process of tracking direction and distance travelled and calculating position from those two numbers alone. Amundsen was meticulous about this. He took readings frequently, checked the compass against the sun when it was visible, and kept careful records of their daily progress. He knew that being even slightly off course over hundreds of miles could mean arriving at a point that was not the pole, or missing depots on the return. The mathematics of dead reckoning at the bottom of the world, where compass behaviour is affected by proximity to the magnetic pole, required constant attention and adjustment. The sun, when it showed itself, was both useful and strange. At this latitude and at this time of year, the sun does not set. It circles the sky in a low arc, never dipping below the horizon, casting light at all hours. This is useful for navigation. The sun's position in the sky can be used to determine direction, but it is also disorienting in a way that people who have not experienced it find difficult to imagine. There is no dusk, no dawn, no darkening that tells your body it is time to rest. The tent is bright inside at midnight. The light outside when you step out at 2 in the morning is the same as the light at 2 in the afternoon. The body, which has spent a lifetime using darkness as a signal, has to be managed instead by the clock. Amundsen enforced regular schedules partly for this reason. Not just efficiency, but because the circadian rhythm needed structure when the environment provided none. There is one question that Amundsen was turning over during these final weeks on the plateau, and he was honest about it in his diary. He did not know where Scott was. He knew Scott had left Cape Evans, and he knew Scott's general plan, but he had no way of knowing how far Scott had come or whether Scott might somehow arrive at the pole first. The telegram Amundsen had sent from Madeira in August 1910 had given Scott notice, but notice is not the same as information about progress. Out on the plateau with no communication possible in either direction, the uncertainty was simply something Amundsen carried alongside everything else. He did not dwell on it dramatically, but its surface is occasionally in the diaries. A brief mention of Scott's name, a note about the possibility, and then a return to the practical matters of the day. He had done what he could do. He was moving as fast as conditions allowed. Whether it was enough was a question the plateau could not answer. By the time they cleared the broken ice near 87 degrees and found smoother going again, the mood in the camp had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, these were not men given to dramatic shifts of mood. But there was a quality to the evenings that Bjaaland and others noted, a growing sense of proximity. The numbers on the latitude readings were changing in a direction that was becoming meaningful. 87, 88. Each degree of latitude at these distances represents about 69 miles. The gaps were closing. The thing they had come all this way for was somewhere ahead of them, still invisible, still featureless, still just a point on a mathematical grid, but closer now than it had ever been. The dogs, remarkably, were still pulling well. 18 dogs for 4 sledges, on a surface that was now mostly firm, in cold that was stable if not mild. Hansen's lead team in particular seemed to find something on the smooth plateau that the broken terrain had prevented. A rhythm, a pace, a working relationship between the animals and the man behind them that was almost efficient. Amundsen noted the dog's performance with the same quiet satisfaction he brought to the depot counts and the navigation calculations. The system was working. The plan, so carefully constructed over years of preparation and months of execution, was holding together. And yet the plateau had one more thing to offer before they reached the end of it, and that was simply more of itself. More cold, more featureless white, more compass bearings, more camp routines, more days that looked like the day before. The body tires of sameness in a way that is distinct from physical exhaustion. It is a tiredness of the mind, a wearing away of the small mental energy that makes the next step feel different from the last one. Amundsen managed this in himself and in the men around him through the same mechanisms he managed everything else. Routine, discipline, careful attention to the practical details that gave each day its own small shape. Check the dogs, check the compass, check the rations, note the temperature, mark the distance, sleep, wake, move south. Somewhere around 88 degrees south, with roughly 130 miles remaining to the pole, the plateau began to feel less infinite. That is not a geographic change. It was still the same plateau, the same ice, the same pale sky. But something in the calculation had shifted. The distances remaining were now distances that could be covered in days rather than weeks. The mathematics of the journey had changed character, and with that change came a quieter, more focused kind of attention in the camp. The men were not celebrating, they were not careless, but they were present in a way that the long middle of the plateau had made harder to sustain. The pole was ahead. It was real. It was close enough now to think about in specific terms rather than as an abstraction at the end of a very long line. Amundsen kept moving them south. The compass held its bearing. The dogs kept pulling. And the plateau, enormous and cold and indifferent as it had been from the first morning they had stepped onto it from the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, continued to offer nothing but distance. Distance that was at last running out. On the morning of December 14th, 1911, Roald Amundsen and his 4 companions broke camp on the polar plateau as they had broken camp every morning for weeks. The dogs were harnessed, the sledges were loaded, the compass was checked. The routine was the same routine, and yet it was not the same morning. The latitude reading from the previous evening's sunsight had placed them close enough that the arithmetic was simple. If conditions held, if nothing went wrong, if the numbers were right, they would reach 90 degrees south before the day was out. Amundsen did not write about that morning with any particular drama. His diary entries from this period are notable for their restraint. He was not a man who wrote toward climax. He recorded temperatures, distances, surface conditions, the behaviour of the dogs, the direction of the wind. Occasionally a sentence or two about the mood of the group or a difficulty encountered. But on December 14th, even the practical entries carry a different weight, because the reader knows what the writer knew was coming. They set out south. The surface was firm. The temperature was around minus 23 degrees Celsius, which by the standards of the plateau was almost mild. The sky was clear, the sun circling in its low arc, the light flat and even in the way that Antarctic light tends to be. Not harsh, not warm, just present everywhere at once, casting almost no shadows. Helmer Hansen was driving the lead sledge, as he had done for most of the journey. His dogs were pulling steadily. Behind him came the other 3 sledges, with Wisting, Hassel and Bjarland, each managing their own teams. Amundsen moved among them, checking, watching, calculating. The hours passed, the way hours pass on a featureless plain, not quickly but without obvious resistance. There was nothing to mark the distance except the number on the compass and the count of miles behind them. And then, sometime in the early afternoon, the navigation instrument said what they had been approaching for 97 days. They were there, or close enough that the difference was within the margin of their instruments. Amundsen called a halt. What happened next was described by several of the men in their diaries and later in interviews, and there is a consistency to the accounts that makes it feel reliable. They did not shout. They did not run. They stood on the ice and looked at each other, and then Amundsen produced the Norwegian flag, a flag that had been carried all this way folded in a pack, and all 5 men placed their hands on the flagpole at the same moment before it was pushed into the snow. It was a deliberate gesture, not spontaneous. Amundsen had planned it. He wanted the moment to belong to all of them equally, not just to the man who had led the expedition. All 5 hands on the pole, all 5 names on the achievement. It was December 14th, 1911. The time was approximately 3 in the afternoon by their camp clock. The temperature was around -23. The wind was light. The surface was hard snow. There was no mountain, no valley, no river, no rock, no feature of any kind to mark the spot. It was exactly like the ice they had been walking on for weeks, because that is what it was. The geographic South Pole is not a place that announces itself. It is a mathematical point on a rotating sphere, and the ice beneath it is the same ice as the ice a mile away or 10 miles away. The flag they planted was the only thing that made it different from anywhere else. Amundsen wrote in his diary that evening, "So we arrived, and were able to plant our flag at the geographical South Pole, God be thanked." That is roughly the level of ceremony in the written record. There is a famous photograph taken that day. 5 men standing near the tent they had pitched, the Norwegian flag planted beside it, the plateau stretching away in every direction. The men look cold and capable and not particularly triumphant. They look like men who have finished a very difficult job and are already thinking about the next part of the work. Bjarland's diary entry was more expressive than Amundsen's, which perhaps says something about the difference in their characters. He wrote that it felt strange to have arrived at a place that looked like everywhere else they had been. He had expected something, some signal from the place itself, and the place offered nothing. Just ice and sky and the flag they had brought themselves. That observation, the strangeness of arriving somewhere that refuses to look like a destination, is one that several of the men circled around in different ways. The pole did not feel like the end of something. It felt like another camp on the plateau, except that the latitude reading finally said 90 degrees. Amundsen named the plateau King Haakon VII's Plateau in honour of the Norwegian king. He had been carrying this name in his plans for some time. The tent they pitched at the pole he named Polheim, home at the pole. It was a small tent, dark in colour to absorb what warmth the sun could offer, and inside it Amundsen placed 2 items that he had also been carrying with deliberate purpose. One was a letter addressed to King Haakon, to be retrieved later as formal documentation of the achievement. The other was a shorter note addressed to Robert Falcon Scott. That note is worth thinking about for a moment. Amundsen knew that Scott was somewhere on the continent, moving toward this same point. He did not know exactly where Scott was, or how far behind him Scott might be, but he knew, with reasonable confidence, that Scott was coming. And so he left a note asking Scott to forward the letter to the king, in the event that Amundsen did not make it back alive. It was a practical request and also, in its way, a strange kind of communication between 2 men who had never met in Antarctica. one of whom had already been here and was leaving, the other of whom was still on his way. The tent with the Norwegian flag would be the first thing Scott's party saw when they arrived. Amundsen knew that. The note was courteous, measured, and must have been extremely difficult to read. They did not leave immediately after planting the flag. Amundsen was not the kind of man to make a symbolic gesture and then rush away before the work was done. He stayed at the pole for 3 days, December 14th, 15th, and 16th, taking careful sun sights at regular intervals to confirm their position as precisely as their instruments allowed. This was important. He knew that questions would be asked when he returned. He knew that some people would want to dispute the claim, as they had disputed Peary's claim on the North Pole. He wanted the navigation record to be as solid as he could make it. The sun sights placed them within a few miles of 90 degrees. To be thorough, Amundsen sent 3 of the men out in different directions on skis, covering a radius of about 12 miles around the camp, to make certain that the true pole fell within the area they had covered. It was methodical in a way that is almost characteristic of the man, not satisfied with being close, wanting the margin of error to be accounted for in every direction. He could not be certain their instruments were perfect. He could be certain that they had covered the ground. During those 3 days, the men rested, ate well, repaired equipment, and attended to the dogs. The dogs had been pulling for nearly 3 months, and the best of them were still in reasonable condition. Lean, hard, experienced in a way that sled dogs become after long work on the ice. Amundsen's care for the dogs was practical rather than sentimental, but it was genuine care nonetheless. He understood that the return journey depended on them. The emotional quality of those 3 days at the pole is harder to describe than the practical details, because the men themselves seemed uncertain how to describe it. There was relief, clearly. Relief that they had made it, that the navigation had held, that the weather had cooperated, that the dogs had performed. There was a kind of satisfaction that comes from a plan executed well over a long time, but the word that comes up most often in the accounts is not triumph or joy. It is something quieter. Amundsen himself used the word relief more than once, and there is a passage in his later memoir where he reflects on this directly, noting with some puzzlement that the achievement he had worked toward for years did not produce the feeling he had expected. He had imagined something larger. What he found was something simpler, a cold tent, a flag in the snow, and the knowledge that the work was done. Part of this may be the nature of the goal itself. The South Pole is not a place you can see from a distance and approach with growing excitement. There is no summit to appear on the horizon, no coastline to emerge from the sea. You walk across flat ice, and then your instruments tell you that you have arrived, and the flat ice continues in every direction exactly as before. The achievement is real, but it exists almost entirely in the numbers. The landscape does not participate. The ice does not care. The sky does not change. You have to bring the meaning with you, and after months of travel, some of the energy required to feel meaning deeply is simply not there anymore. The body has spent it on other things. Bjaaland noted something else in his diary that seems worth mentioning. He wrote that standing at the pole, he thought about the distance back. Not with dread exactly, but with a kind of sober awareness. They had come a long way. They had to go back the same distance. The flag in the snow was not the end of the story. It was the midpoint. And the second half of any long journey carries a different quality than the first. The goal is behind you now, not ahead. And what lies ahead is simply the work of getting home. Amundsen understood this. He had planned the return as carefully as the outward journey. The depots were placed, the distances were calculated, the dogs were still capable. But understanding something and feeling easy about it are not the same thing. The plateau was still the plateau. The distance was still the distance, and the Antarctic had not finished with them yet. On December the 17th, 1911, 3 days after their arrival, Amundsen gave the order to break camp. Polheim was left standing with its flag and its letters inside. The sledges were loaded, the dogs were harnessed. The 5 men turned their backs on the point that no human being had ever stood before they arrived, and they began to move north. The return journey was already waiting for them. The long crossing of the plateau, the descent of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, the ice shelf, and the final run to Framheim. Somewhere far behind them to the south, the tent would stand alone in the wind, holding its letters, waiting for the next visitors. And somewhere ahead of them, still unknown to Amundsen, Robert Falcon Scott was moving toward the same point, a month behind, carrying the weight of a different kind of journey entirely. They moved quickly. That is the first thing worth saying about the return, because it is the thing that surprises people most when they first read the account. After nearly 2 months of careful, measured progress southward, the return journey was fast, not reckless, not rushed in a way that created danger, but genuinely fast. The dogs were lighter now, pulling reduced loads on sledges that had been emptied of much of the food and fuel consumed on the way down. The men were experienced, their bodies hardened to the work, their movements efficient in the way that only comes from weeks of repetition. And the depots were waiting for them, precisely where they had been placed, marking the route home at regular intervals like a thread laid through a labyrinth. The first days back across the polar plateau went well. The weather held reasonably steady. The dogs moved at a pace that surprised even Amundsen, who had always trusted them, but perhaps had not fully anticipated how much easier the return load would make things. Some days they covered more than 30 miles, which on the polar plateau, at altitude, in temperatures that rarely climbed above minus 20 or 30 degrees Celsius, is a remarkable distance. Amundsen noted the daily figures in his diary, with the same matter-of-fact precision he applied to everything. 30 miles. 32 miles. The numbers looked almost casual on the page. The reality behind them was 4 sledges and 18 dogs moving across an enormous white silence, with 5 men on skis alongside, breath rising in the cold air, the compass checked and rechecked, the horizon offering nothing to navigate by except the bearing they already knew. The depot system, which Amundsen had spent so much of the previous February and March laying out, now proved its worth completely. Every cache they reached was exactly as left. The food was there, the fuel was there. The markers they had placed, black flags on bamboo poles, spaced carefully so that one was always visible before the last disappeared behind them, guided the route without ambiguity. This was not luck. It was the result of a very deliberate decision made months earlier, when Amundsen had insisted on placing more supplies than the minimum calculations required. He had built in margin. He'd assumed that the journey would take longer than hoped, that the weather would be worse than expected, that the men would need more calories than the baseline figures suggested. Because he had planned for difficulty, the absence of difficulty felt almost comfortable. The men were eating well on the return. This detail is worth pausing on for a moment, because it stands in such contrast to what was happening elsewhere on the continent at the same time. Amundsen's party had generous rations, pemmican, biscuits, chocolate, dried milk, and on the return, with the pressure of the outward journey behind them, they ate without the careful rationing that tighter planning would have required. Bjarland wrote in his diary that he was actually gaining weight on the return journey. Gaining weight on a polar sledge journey in the Antarctic in December and January. It sounds almost absurd, but it reflects how thoroughly Amundsen had calculated the food supply. He had not just provided enough, he had provided more than enough, and the difference showed in the condition of his men. The dogs were doing something similar. 18 dogs pulling loads that were shrinking every day as food and fuel were consumed from the depots. The lighter the sledges became, the faster the dogs moved, and the faster they moved, the more ground was covered each day, and the sooner the next depot was reached, which further reduced the load. It was almost a self-reinforcing system, not by accident, but by design. Amundsen had understood that the return journey, if the depots held, would be easier than the outward one. He had planned for it to be. The dogs that had survived from the butcher's shop onward were the strongest animals from the original 52. They had been selected in the most brutal possible way for exactly this work. Descending the Axel Heiberg Glacier was a different kind of challenge from the ascent. Going up, the difficulty had been brute effort. Men and dogs hauling heavy sledges up steep ice, fighting for purchase, managing the chaos of crevasses and broken terrain. Going down, the problem was control. A loaded sledge on a steep glacier slope does not want to be controlled, it wants to accelerate. The men used brakes and ropes and their own weight against the sledges to manage the descent, and the dogs, which had climbed the glacier with such difficulty 6 weeks earlier, now had to be managed on the way down so they did not run ahead of the sledges or become tangled in the traces. It was noisy and physical and demanding in a way that was completely different from the quiet, grinding effort of the plateau. But they made it down without serious incident. The glacier that had taken 4 days to climb was descended in a day and a half. Below the mountains, the Ross ice shelf opened up ahead of them, flat, white, featureless, stretching north for hundreds of miles toward Framheim. By this point in the journey, the men knew the shelf. They had crossed it twice, once during the depot laying runs in early 1911, and once on the outward journey just weeks before. They knew its surface, its moods, its particular kind of monotony. The shelf does not offer the dramatic difficulty of the mountains or the altitude sickness of the plateau. What it offers is distance. Mile after mile of white nothing, with the horizon always the same distance away, the sky always the same pale colour, the sound always the same low hush of wind over snow. It is the kind of terrain that tests the mind more than the body, because the body can keep moving, but the mind needs something to fix on, and there is nothing to fix on here. Amundsen handled this the way he handled most things, with routine. The days had a structure: rise, eat, harness the dogs, travel, stop, eat, travel again, camp, eat, sleep. The routine was the anchor. It kept the days from blurring into each other in a way that might have become disorienting. He was also a man who did not require the landscape to entertain him. He was comfortable in silence, comfortable with repetition, comfortable with the idea that a task simply had to be done, and the way to do it was to keep doing it. The daily distances on the ice shelf were sometimes extraordinary. On several days the party covered over 30 miles. The dogs were running well, the surface was firm, the weather was cooperative. There were days when the whole operation felt almost effortless, which is a strange word to use about a sledge journey across Antarctica, but the accounts genuinely convey something like ease during parts of the return. Not complacency, not carelessness, just the quiet satisfaction of a machine that has been built correctly and is now running as intended. On January 6, 1912, they reached the depot at 82 degrees south. Everything was in order. They ate, rested the dogs, and continued. On January 9th, they passed 80 degrees south. The distances between depots were being covered faster than the schedule Amundsen had set. He noted this in his diary without particular celebration, the way a careful person notes that a train is running ahead of time. Useful, good, but not a reason to stop paying attention. The final stretch across the ice shelf toward the Bay of Whales was covered at something close to a run. The dogs seemed to understand, in whatever way dogs understand these things, that they were going home. Their pace increased. The men let them go. On January 25, 1912, the 5 sledges pulled into Framheim. The journey from the South Pole back to base had taken 39 days. The entire round trip from Framheim to the Pole and back had taken 99 days. They had covered roughly 1,860 miles in total. The men who had stayed at Framheim during the expedition came out to meet them. There was food, warmth, shelter, and the particular relief of a wooden building after months of tent living. Amundsen wrote that the greeting was warm but not effusive, which seems appropriate for a group of Norwegian polar explorers who had been living together since the previous year and were not given to theatrical displays. They ate, They talked, they rested, the dogs were fed and cared for, the equipment was checked and stored. The whole operation wound down with the same quiet competence that had characterized it from the beginning. It is worth sitting with those numbers for a moment. 99 days, roughly 1,860 miles, 5 men, 4 sledges, 18 surviving dogs, no deaths, no serious injuries, no scurvy, no starvation, no frostbite severe enough to cause lasting damage. The men arrived back at Framheim in better condition than many explorers return from far less demanding journeys. Bjarland, as noted, had actually put on weight. Amundsen himself was lean and fit. The dogs were tired but alive and healthy. By the standards of Antarctic exploration in 1912, this was not just a success. It was something close to a perfect operation. What makes this even more striking is what was happening simultaneously, though Amundsen did not yet know the details. While his team was crossing the ice shelf at a brisk pace in the first weeks of January, Scott's polar party was approaching the pole from the other direction. While Amundsen's men were descending the Axel Heiberg Glacier in reasonable comfort, Scott's men were struggling with conditions that were deteriorating faster than their plans had accounted for. And while Amundsen was sitting in the warmth of Framheim on January 25th, eating a proper meal and beginning to think about how to get the news to the outside world, Scott's party was still somewhere on the Ross ice shelf, still more than 2 months from the outcome that history would eventually record. Amundsen did not know any of this. He knew only that he had reached the pole and returned safely, and that Scott had been heading for the same point. He assumed, reasonably, that Scott had also reached the pole by now, or would reach it soon. He had left the letter at Polheim for exactly that reason, addressed to King Haakon, to be delivered by Scott in the event that Amundsen's party did not return. He had no way of knowing what was unfolding on the other side of the continent's interior, and he would not know until months later, when the full story finally reached the outside world. For now, the contrast between the two expeditions existed only in the ice and the cold, unobserved by anyone except the men living inside it. There is something in the efficiency of Amundsen's return that has occasionally made people uncomfortable, as if the cleanness of it somehow diminishes the achievement, or as if suffering is a necessary ingredient in a story worth telling. That is an understandable feeling, but it's probably the wrong way to think about it. The absence of catastrophe on Amundsen's return was not an accident of fortune. It was the result of years of preparation, careful planning, the right equipment, the right methods, and a team selected and trained for exactly this kind of work. The smoothness was the point. Amundsen had set out to reach the South Pole and return safely, and he had done precisely that, with margins to spare. That this required less drama than other expeditions is not a flaw in the story. It is the achievement. The Fram was waiting at the Bay of Whales. The ship had been there since the previous year, and the crew had spent the Antarctic winter in the pack ice before returning to the bay as planned. On January 30th, 1912, 5 days after arriving at Framheim, Amundsen and his polar party boarded the Fram. The base was dismantled, the remaining dogs taken aboard, and the ship began to move north through the Ross Sea, carrying 5 men who had stood at the bottom of the world and come home again with their fingers and their lives intact. The next stop was Hobart, Tasmania, the nearest port with a telegraph station, and the message that Amundsen was carrying, the news that the South Pole had been reached, was about to move from the ice into the world. But what that news would find waiting for it, and what it would mean against the backdrop of what was still happening on the Antarctic plateau, was something that not even Amundsen could have fully anticipated as the Fram moved north through the Southern Ocean, leaving the ice behind. While Amundsen's ship moved steadily north through the Ross Sea, something else was happening on the ice behind him. Something that no one outside Antarctica yet knew about, and that would not be fully understood until nearly a year later, when a search party pushed through the snow and found a tent. Scott's polar party had reached the South Pole on January 17th, 1912. That date is worth sitting with for a moment. Amundsen had stood at 90 degrees south on December the 14th, 1911. Scott arrived 34 days later. In the context of a journey measured in months, 34 days is not an enormous gap. But in terms of what it meant to the 5 men who arrived and saw what was waiting for them, it was everything. The 5 men in Scott's final party were Robert Falcon Scott himself, Edward Wilson, Lawrence Oates, Henry Bowers, and Edgar Evans. They had been man-hauling their sledges for weeks by that point. The motor sledges, which had seemed like such a promising piece of technology when they left Cape Evans, had broken down within the first few days of the journey. The ponies had been shot at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, which had been the plan, but the plan had always assumed that the men would be in better condition by the time the hauling began. They were not. The cold had been harder than expected. The surfaces had been worse. The distances between depots had stretched in ways that left the men arriving at each one tired and short on margin. They had climbed the Beardmore Glacier, which is one of the largest glaciers in the world, roughly 125 miles long and up to 25 miles wide, rising about 10,000 feet from the Ross ice shelf to the polar plateau. It is a different route from the Axel Heiberg, which Amundsen had used, and it had been travelled before by Shackleton in 1908, who had gotten within 97 miles of the pole before turning back. Scott knew the Beardmore. It was not unknown ground. But knowing a route and traversing it in the right condition are different things, and by the time Scott's party reached the plateau, they were already running behind the pace they needed. And then they saw it. On January 16th, Bowers spotted something dark against the white. It was a black flag, tied to a sledge runner planted in the snow. Around it were the tracks of sledges and dogs, pressed into the surface and still legible in the cold, dry air. The men knew immediately what it meant. Someone had been here before them. The following day, January 17th, they reached the South Pole. Or rather, they reached the position of 90 degrees south, which on the surface of Antarctica looks like every other point on the polar plateau. Flat, white, featureless, brutally cold. But there was Polheim, the small tent Amundsen had left behind. There was the Norwegian flag still standing. There was a letter inside the tent addressed to King Haakon VII of Norway, with a separate note for Scott asking him to deliver it in the event that Amundsen's party had not survived the return journey. Scott's diary entry for that day is one of the most quietly devastating things in the literature of exploration. He wrote, "The worst has happened." And then, a little further on, "All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority." There is a lot packed into those words. The acknowledgement that the goal was gone, the physical description of the pole itself. Awful, not in the modern casual sense, but in the older sense, meaning something that fills you with a particular kind of dread. And that phrase, without the reward of priority, which tells you exactly what Scott understood about what the journey had cost and what it had not delivered. They had come 800 miles. They had climbed a glacier, crossed a plateau, dragged their own sledges at altitude in temperatures that regularly dropped below -30, and someone else had done it first. They took their photographs at the pole. The images are well known now. 5 men in heavy clothing standing in front of the Union Jack, their faces showing something that is hard to read precisely. Not despair exactly, not nothing, something in between. Wilson, who was a doctor and a scientist, and by all accounts one of the most steadfast people on the expedition, wrote in his diary that the pole was a terrible disappointment. Bowers, who was physically remarkable and almost always positive, wrote that it was a blow. Oates, who was a cavalry officer and not given to emotional expression, said relatively little. Evans, the strongest man on the team physically, was already showing signs that something was wrong, though no one yet understood how serious it was. They spent one night at the pole and began the return journey on January 18th. 800 miles back to Cape Evans, across the plateau, down the Beardmore, across the Ross ice shelf. The same ground they had already crossed once, now in reverse, in deteriorating condition. with the psychological weight of defeat added to the physical weight of exhaustion. The plateau crossing went badly. The surfaces were soft and slow, the temperatures were lower than expected, and the men's caloric intake, which had been calculated carefully but perhaps not generously enough, was not keeping pace with what their bodies were burning. Edgar Evans had injured his hand at some point, and the wound was not healing. He was also suffering from what may have been concussion after a fall. His condition worsened steadily across the plateau, and by the time the party began descending the Beardmore Glacier in early February, he was struggling to keep pace. Evans died on February 17, 1912, near the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. He had fallen behind the others, and when they went back to look for him, they found him on the ice, barely conscious. He died that evening without recovering. He was 37 years old. He had been, by most accounts, the physically strongest member of the party at the start of the journey, which gives you some sense of what the plateau had taken from all of them. 4 men now crossing the Ross ice shelf. The distances between depots were long. The weather was closing in. Lawrence Oates had severe frostbite in his feet, and the frostbite was getting worse. He could still walk, but each day it cost him more. He knew, and the others knew, that he was slowing the group. The question of what to do about that, or whether anything could be done, sat over the tent at night without being fully spoken. On the night of March 15th, or the morning of March 16th, the exact date is slightly uncertain in the diaries, Oates told the others that he was going outside and might be some time. He walked out of the tent into a blizzard. He was 32 years old. He did not come back. His body was never found. Scott wrote about it in his diary with a kind of controlled grief that is almost harder to read than open despair. He called it the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. Whatever one thinks of that framing, the fact of what Oates did, walking out into a blizzard in the hope that his death would give the others a better chance, is not something that softens with familiarity. 3 men now: Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. They were approximately 155 miles from their main depot at 1 ton, and about 11 miles from a smaller depot that should have had food and fuel. The weather had turned ferocious. Temperatures had dropped to -40 and below. A blizzard pinned them in their tent for days. They could not move. The fuel in their Primus stove was running low, and when they reached the depots they found that some of the fuel had leaked from the canisters, a problem caused by the leather washers in the caps deteriorating in the cold, a small practical failure with catastrophic consequences. Scott's final diary entries, written inside that tent, are measured and clear. He was not raving. He was not incoherent. He wrote about the weather, about the condition of the others, about his regret that he had not been able to do more for the men who had followed him. He wrote a series of letters, to Wilson's wife, to Bowers' mother, to friends, to the public. He wrote a message to the public that ended with a line that became famous. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. And then, as the blizzard continued and the cold deepened, the writing stopped. Scott, Wilson and Bowers died in their tent around March 29, 1912. The tent was found on November 12, 1912, by a search party from Cape Evans. The 3 men were inside in their sleeping bags. The tent was collapsed over them by the searchers, and a cairn of snow was built on top. Their bodies remain there today, slowly moving north with the Ross ice shelf, as the ice carries everything on it toward the sea. In perhaps a few hundred years the ice will calve, and whatever remains of the tent and the 3 men inside it will enter the ocean. The search party also found Scott's diaries and letters, which were brought back to Britain and eventually published. They found the geological samples that Wilson had collected on the Beardmore Glacier, 35 pounds of rock specimens that the men had been hauling until the end, long after survival had become the only reasonable priority. Wilson had refused to abandon them. The samples contained fossils of Glossopteris, a plant that grew in warm climates, providing evidence that Antarctica had once been part of a warmer landmass. They were scientifically valuable. Wilson knew they were scientifically valuable. He kept them. That detail has always seemed to say something important about who he was. The news of Scott's death reached Britain in February 1913, more than a year after the men had died. The country mourned publicly and intensely. Scott was given a state funeral in absentia. Streets and schools were named after him. His image appeared on postcards, in newspapers, in paintings. He became a symbol of something that Britain in 1913 needed to believe in. Sacrifice, endurance, the idea that failure pursued with courage was its own kind of victory. Whether that framing was fair to Scott, or useful, or accurate, is a question that historians have been debating ever since. What is simply true is that 5 men set out from the South Pole on January 18, 1912, and none of them came home. They had reached their goal. They had done the thing they set out to do. They had stood at the bottom of the world, taken their photographs, and turned around. The return journey killed them, not the pole itself, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow accumulation of cold, distance, insufficient food, deteriorating conditions, and perhaps a small amount of bad luck layered over the larger structural problems in their planning and equipment. The cold that March, as it happens, was later determined to be unusually severe. Records suggest it was the coldest March in that region since measurements began. Whether that would have made the difference between survival and death is impossible to say with certainty. It might have, it might not have. The margin by that point was thin enough that almost anything could have tipped it. What Amundsen knew when he eventually learned the full story was that the letter he had left at Polheim had not been delivered. Scott had carried it out of the tent, but it never reached Norway through Scott's hand. Amundsen had written it as a precaution, in case he himself did not survive. In a different kind of symmetry, the man he'd addressed it to had also not survived. The letter eventually made its way to Norway through other means. King Haakon received it. Amundsen received the news of Scott's death sometime in early 1913, months after the world had already heard it. He said very little publicly. He had always been careful about how he discussed Scott. He acknowledged the courage of the British party. He did not gloat, and by all accounts he found the deaths genuinely troubling. Whether he felt any private responsibility, or whether he thought about the telegram he had sent from Madeira and what it had set in motion, is not something the historical record tells us clearly. He was not a man who put that kind of thing on paper. The 2 expeditions had set out for the same point on the same continent in the same season, and they had ended in the most different ways imaginable. One returned with all 5 men, in good health, on schedule, with the goal achieved and the equipment intact. The other left 5 men in the ice. The contrast between those outcomes is not a simple story, and it is not the whole story, but it is the fact that history had to carry forward, and what it meant about planning, about method, about luck, about the nature of exploration itself, is exactly the question that the next part of this story turns on. So what actually made the difference? That is the question that historians, polar researchers and careful readers have been asking for more than a century, and it deserves a careful answer. Not a simple one, not a comfortable one. And not the kind of answer that turns one man into a genius and the other into a cautionary tale, because neither of those framings is quite honest. The most fundamental difference between the 2 expeditions was dogs. Amundsen built his entire strategy around them. He had grown up around working dogs in Norway, had observed Inuit dog handling techniques during his time in the Arctic, and he understood with practical clarity what a well-fed, well-managed team of sled dogs could do on polar ice. He brought 97 dogs to Antarctica. He trained his men to handle them. He planned his routes, his depots, and his caloric calculations around the assumption that dogs would do the majority of the hauling work, and they did. On the Ross ice shelf, his teams were covering 20 to 30 miles a day with relative consistency. The dogs pulling hard, the men skiing alongside or riding the sledges when conditions allowed. The dogs were not a backup plan, they were the engine. Scott's relationship with dogs was different. He had used them on his first Antarctic expedition, the Discovery expedition of 1901 to 1904, but without great success, and he had come away from that experience somewhat sceptical of their reliability. He had also been influenced by Fridtjof Nansen's writings, which emphasised man-hauling as a purer, more self-reliant form of polar travel. For the Terra Nova expedition, Scott brought dogs but also ponies, which Shackleton had used with partial success, and motor sledges, which were an entirely new technology. The idea was flexibility, different tools for different conditions. In practice, the motor sledges broke down within the first few days of the southern journey, long before they could contribute meaningfully. The ponies struggled in the cold, required more complex logistics than dogs, and had to be shot at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. That left man-hauling as the primary method for the final 400 miles to the pole and the 800 miles back. 5 men pulling their own supplies across the polar plateau at altitude, in temperatures well below -30. It is not that man-hauling is impossible. People have done extraordinary things by pulling sledges. But as the primary method for a journey of that distance in those conditions, with those caloric constraints, it was an enormous physical burden to carry. Skiing is the next piece. Amundsen's 5 men were all experienced Nordic skiers. Bjarland, in fact, had been a competitive skier before the expedition, and was considered one of the best in Norway at the time. For them, skiing across the Antarctic was not a technique they were learning. It was something close to natural movement. They were efficient on skis, they were fast, and the skis allowed them to cover ground with far less physical expenditure per mile than walking. Scott's team had skis and had trained with them, but most of the men were not strong skiers. Bowers, notably, did not ski at all on the final leg to the pole. He walked the entire distance. Over 800 miles, the energy cost of that difference accumulates in ways that are hard to fully calculate but easy to understand in principle. Depot placement was another area where the 2 expeditions diverged in ways that mattered enormously on the return. Amundsen had laid depots at 80, 81 and 82 degrees south during the autumn of 1911, and his team placed additional depots on the way to the pole. Each depot was carefully marked with tall flags on long bamboo poles, sometimes with additional flags extending outward in a line so that a navigator slightly off course could still find the cache. The depots were generously stocked. On the return journey, Amundsen's men arrived at each one to find more food than they needed. They were eating well, they were gaining weight. By the time they reached Framheim, several of the men had actually put on pounds during the return trip, which tells you something about how the logistics had been designed. Scott's depot system had a specific vulnerability that became critical on the return. The main food depot, Wonton Depot, had been placed at 79 degrees 29 minutes south rather than at 80 degrees south as originally planned. The reasons were complicated. The ponies were struggling, the weather had turned, and the decision was made to stop short. That shortfall of roughly 30 miles probably did not seem significant in the autumn of 1911. On the return journey in March 1912, with 3 men dying in their tent just 11 miles from Wonton Depot, those 30 miles were the difference between a rescue cache and an unreachable one. A relief party had actually been sent out to Wonton Depot with extra supplies, but it turned back due to cold before reaching Scott's position. The gap was small, the consequences were absolute. Caloric planning is a quieter but important difference. Amundsen's rations were generous. His team was eating around 4,500 calories a day at the pole, with additional food available from the dogs they had slaughtered at the butcher's shop. Fresh dog meat provided protein and fat that supplemented the planned rations in ways that were nutritionally significant. Scott's rations were calculated more tightly, and they relied heavily on pemmican and biscuits with limited fat content. At altitude, in extreme cold, performing heavy physical labour, a caloric deficit does not announce itself immediately. It accumulates. Over weeks, it becomes weakness, slower recovery, impaired judgment, reduced resistance to cold. Edgar Evans showed signs of physical deterioration well before his death near the Beardmore Glacier, and some historians believe he was already suffering from the compounding effects of inadequate nutrition, frostbite, and a head injury, he had sustained in a crevasse fall. The body under those conditions has very little margin. The choice of base location was a structural advantage that Amundsen had from the beginning. Framheim at the Bay of Whales sat on the Ross ice shelf at roughly 78 degrees 30 minutes south. Cape Evans, Scott's base, was at about 77 degrees 38 minutes south. The difference was approximately 60 miles closer to the pole, which meant 60 fewer miles to travel each way. Over a journey of nearly 1,900 miles round trip, 120 fewer miles is not trivial. It is roughly 4 or 5 fewer days of travel. Those days, on the return journey in deteriorating conditions, were days that Scott's party did not have. Now, it would be unfair and inaccurate to present this as a simple story of competence against incompetence. Scott was not a fool. He was an experienced naval officer who had already led one Antarctic expedition. His team included some of the most capable men in British polar exploration. Edward Wilson was a scientist of genuine distinction, a doctor, a naturalist, a careful and rigorous observer. Henry Bowers was by many accounts one of the toughest and most practically capable men on the expedition. Lawrence Oates was an experienced soldier who had served in the Boer War and who managed the ponies with as much skill as the animals allowed. These were not men who failed through laziness or cowardice. The scientific work of Scott's expedition was also substantial and serious. The Terra Nova expedition produced important research in geology, meteorology, biology, and glaciology. The geological samples that Wilson hauled off the Beardmore Glacier, the ones containing Glossopteris fossils, contributed meaningfully to the understanding of continental drift. The meteorological records kept by the expedition scientists at Cape Evans provided data that researchers are still using today. Scott himself was genuinely committed to the scientific mission alongside the geographic one. That was not a cover story. It was real, and it shaped how the expedition was structured and resourced. But the geographic goal, the pole itself, was a race, and it was lost. And the loss of it, and then the loss of the men, came from a combination of structural choices and something else that is hard to quantify. The weather in March 1912 was, by later analysis, genuinely unusual. Temperature records from the region suggest that the March of 1912 was the coldest March documented in that area since systematic observation began. Temperatures dropped to around minus 40 degrees Celsius during the period when Scott's party was making their final desperate marches. At those temperatures, the friction of sledge runners on snow increases significantly. Cold, dry snow does not lubricate a sledge runner the way slightly warmer snow does, and the result is that pulling becomes dramatically harder. The men were already weakened, already behind on calories, already struggling with frostbite, and the cold that month was working against them in ways that went beyond the ordinary difficulty of Antarctic travel. Whether warmer weather would have saved them is not something anyone can answer with certainty. The margin was thin enough that it is possible. The structural problems in their planning were serious enough that it might not have been sufficient. Most historians who have studied the expedition carefully tend to land somewhere in that honest middle ground, acknowledging the planning differences while also acknowledging that Amundsen had advantages, some earned and some geographical, and that the weather in March 1912 was a factor that no amount of planning could fully have anticipated. What is clear is that the two expeditions were not mirror images of each other facing the same challenge with different outcomes. They were genuinely different in philosophy, method, and design from the start. Amundsen approached the South Pole as a logistical problem to be solved with the best available tools, used in the most efficient possible way. He was not romantic about it. He was not performing for an audience. He wanted to get there, confirm the position, and get back, and he designed everything toward that single goal with a precision that left very little to chance. Scott's expedition was doing several things at once: geographic achievement, scientific research, national prestige, and the demonstration of a particular ideal of British endurance. Those things are not incompatible, but they create a more complex machine with more variables, more things that can go wrong. There is also something worth saying about the role of experience with specific environments. Amundsen's team had spent their lives in cold climates. They understood snow, ice, cold, and dogs in a way that was not theoretical. Helmer Hansen, who drove the lead dog team for much of the journey, was from northern Norway and had extensive experience with sled dogs in Arctic conditions. Bjarland had grown up skiing. Wisting and Hassel were similarly experienced in cold weather work. Scott's men were brave and capable, but most of them had not grown up with the specific physical knowledge that comes from living in a cold environment from childhood. That kind of knowledge is not easily taught in a training period before an expedition. It is accumulated over years, and it shows up in small decisions, in how you handle a dog team in difficult conditions, in how you read the surface of the snow, in how you conserve energy on skis over a long day. None of this is meant to diminish Scott or his men. The fact that they reached the pole at all, under the conditions they were operating in, with the methods they were using, is a remarkable physical achievement. The fact that 3 of them continue to write, to collect samples, to think clearly, and to care for each other in the final weeks of their lives says something about their character that no comparison with Amundsen can reduce. They were not failures. They were men who attempted something enormous and were defeated by a combination of structural disadvantage, unusual weather, and the simple, unforgiving mathematics of cold and distance. Amundsen succeeded because he had designed a machine that matched the environment. Scott's machine was designed for several purposes at once, and the environment, in the end, did not accommodate the complexity. That is perhaps the clearest and most honest way to put it. Not a moral judgment, not a verdict on courage or intelligence, just the shape of 2 different approaches meeting the same brutal set of conditions, and what happened when they did. The world, of course, received the 2 stories very differently, and how those stories travelled and settled into public memory is its own fascinating chapter in what this expedition became. Amundsen reached Hobart, Tasmania on March the 7th, 1912. He had been at sea for weeks, moving north from Antarctica with the news sealed inside him, waiting for the moment he could release it to the world. When the Fram pulled into the harbour and he was able to send his telegrams, the message went out almost immediately. He had reached the South Pole on December 14th, 1911. Norway had done it first. The reaction was swift and enormous. Newspapers across Europe and North America ran the story on their front pages. In Norway, the response was something close to national euphoria. The country had only been fully independent from Sweden since 1905, just 7 years earlier, and Amundsen's achievement arrived like a statement about what Norway was and what it could do. Here was a small northern nation, newly sovereign, and its explorer had just accomplished what no human being in history had ever accomplished. The pride was real and deep, and it attached itself to Amundsen in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. Amundsen himself was not a man who wore celebration easily. He was practical, private, and more comfortable planning the next expedition than standing at a podium receiving applause. But he understood the obligations that came with the achievement. He lectured extensively, across Europe, in Britain, in the United States. He wrote his account of the expedition, simply titled The South Pole, which was published later in 1912 and remains one of the clearest, most methodical expedition narratives ever written. It does not dramatise, it explains. It describes conditions, distances, decisions and results with the same calm precision that characterised the journey itself. Reading it, you get the sense of a man who genuinely believed that the most interesting thing about the expedition was how it worked, not how it felt. In Britain, the initial reception of Amundsen's news was complicated. There had been an expectation, not entirely spoken aloud but widely understood, that Scott would be first. The British expedition had the larger public profile, the national backing, the weight of tradition behind it. When Amundsen's telegrams arrived, there was genuine congratulation from some quarters and genuine disappointment from others. Scott himself, still on the ice at that moment and unaware that the news had broken, had left no public statement to be received. He was still travelling. The world did not yet know what was happening to him. That knowledge came later, and it changed everything. The search party that went out from Cape Evans in the spring of 1912, the Antarctic spring, meaning October and November in the southern hemisphere, found the tent on November 12, 1912. Inside were Scott, Wilson and Bowers. They had been dead for approximately 8 months. The tent had been partially buried by drifting snow, but the bodies were preserved by the cold. Scott's diary was recovered. His final entries, written in weakening handwriting as the blizzard held them in place and their fuel ran out, were among the most affecting documents to come out of the entire era of polar exploration. The search party read them. They built a cairn of snow over the tent, leaving the men inside, and placed a cross on top. They took the diaries and the geological samples that Wilson had insisted on carrying to the end. When the news reached Britain in February 1913, the response was extraordinary. Scott was mourned as a national hero of the highest order. Memorial services were held across the country. King George V attended a service at St Paul's Cathedral. The story of Scott's death, the courage, the endurance, the final letters to his wife and to the families of his men, the line in his diary reading, "I do not regret this journey," was absorbed into British culture with a depth and permanence that Amundsen's success, for all its brilliance, never quite matched in the public imagination of that country. This is one of the stranger outcomes of the whole episode. Amundsen won the race. He got there first, he got back safely, all 5 of his men survived, and the operation was executed with a precision that has rarely been matched in the history of exploration. But in the decades that followed, it was Scott's story that was told and retold in Britain, in schools, in books, in films, in statues. The tragedy had a grip on the imagination that the triumph could not compete with. There is something in human nature that responds to a noble defeat more viscerally than to a clean victory, particularly when the defeat involves death, and letters, and a man writing in a frozen tent that he does not regret what he did. In Norway, the opposite was true. Amundsen was celebrated, studied and remembered as one of the great figures of Norwegian history. But even there, the celebration was somewhat muted by his personality. He was not a warm public figure. He was respected more than loved. He had enemies, some of them made during the expedition itself, including the falling out with Johansen, who had publicly criticised him during the false start and was excluded from the pole party as a result. Johansen died by suicide in January 1913, just months after the expedition returned, and the circumstances of his exclusion had clearly contributed to his declining mental state. That shadow lingered. Amundsen did not stop exploring after the South Pole. If anything, the achievement seemed to clarify rather than satisfy his ambition. He returned to the question of the Arctic, completing the Northeast Passage, the route along the northern coast of Russia, between 1918 and 1920 aboard a ship called Maud. He made 2 attempts to reach the North Pole by air in 1925, flying in 2 Dornier flying boats with a crew that included the American explorer Lincoln Ellsworth. They reached 87 degrees 43 minutes north before engine trouble forced them down onto the ice. 3 of the 6 men were injured in the landing. The ice surface was too broken to take off from, and they spent 3 weeks hacking out a runway by hand before managing to get both aircraft airborne again and reaching Spitsbergen. It was, by any measure, a remarkable survival story, and it received far less attention than it deserved. Then, in May 1926, Amundsen achieved something that is often overlooked in the shadow of the South Pole. He flew over the North Pole, not claimed it from the ice surface, but flew across it in an airship, the Norge, a semi-rigid dirigible designed and piloted by the Italian engineer Umberto Nobile. The flight went from Spitsbergen across the Arctic Ocean to Alaska, crossing directly over the geographic North Pole on May 12, 1926. Amundsen was on board, as was Ellsworth and a crew that included both Norwegian and Italian members. It was the first undisputed crossing of the Arctic Ocean by air and the first verified overflight of the North Pole. The man who had stood at the South Pole in 1911 had now passed over the North Pole in 1926. He had, in a sense, completed the set. The relationship between Amundsen and Nobile did not survive the flight intact. There were disputes about credit, about whose expedition it had really been, about who deserved the recognition. Nobile gave interviews in Italy that emphasised his own role and the Italian contribution. Amundsen, who had a talent for quiet fury, responded in kind. The two men became publicly hostile to each other in ways that generated considerable newspaper coverage at the time, and probably generated more heat than either of them needed. Then, in 1928, Nobile organised his own Arctic airship expedition aboard a new dirigible called the Italia. On the return from the North Pole, the Italia crashed onto the ice. Several crew members were killed in the impact. Nobile and others survived on the ice, injured and stranded, sending distress signals. A massive international rescue effort was launched, and Amundsen, despite his personal hostility toward Nobile, joined it. He boarded a French Latham 47 seaplane on June 18, 1928, along with 5 other crew members, and flew north toward the search area. Somewhere over the Barents Sea, the aircraft disappeared. No distress signal, no wreckage found for months. A single float from the aircraft was eventually recovered, and some fragments of debris, but the plane and the men aboard it were never found. Roald Amundsen was 55 years old. He died somewhere in the Arctic, in the sea or on the ice, searching for a man he had publicly despised. The irony of that ending is hard to ignore, and it is the kind of irony that history tends to present without comment, as if it is simply what happened and the meaning is yours to work out for yourself. He left no body to bury, no grave to visit. The man who had planned everything so carefully, who had left so little to chance, who had calculated routes and rations and distances with a precision that still draws admiration a century later, he vanished. Just gone. Somewhere in the cold water north of Norway, in the same kind of landscape he had spent his life studying and crossing. Nobile, for what it is worth, was eventually rescued. He lived until 1978. He was 93 years old. The contrast between how Amundsen and Scott are remembered has been a subject of discussion among historians for decades now. In Britain, Scott's reputation went through a long and complicated reassessment during the latter half of the 20th century. Writers and historians began examining the planning decisions more critically, questioning whether Scott's methods had been adequate, whether the man-hauling philosophy had been a form of romantic stubbornness, whether the outcome had been more preventable than the heroic narrative allowed. Roland Huntford's 1979 biography of Amundsen and Scott was particularly influential, sharply critical of Scott, admiring of Amundsen, and it sparked a significant debate in Britain about how national memory shapes historical judgment. The book was controversial, accused by some of being unfair to Scott and too reverential toward Amundsen, but it forced a more honest reckoning with what the two expeditions had actually done and how they had done it. By now, the historical picture has settled into something more nuanced than either pure heroism or pure critique. Scott is still remembered in Britain with genuine affection, but the uncritical reverence of the early 20th century has given way to a more complicated respect for his courage and his character, while acknowledging the limitations of his methods. Amundsen is recognised more widely outside Norway than he once was, though he has never quite acquired the cultural resonance in the English-speaking world that Scott has. There is something almost fitting about that. Amundsen would not have minded being underestimated. He had spent his whole life being underestimated, and he had always found a way to use it. The 5 men who reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, Amundsen, Bjaaland, Hansen, Hassel, and Wisting, did not become famous in the same proportions. Amundsen's name became the one that carried the achievement forward. Bjaaland went home to Norway and returned to his life as a craftsman and ski maker. Hansen continued working in the north, in Svalbard and the Arctic. Hassel worked in customs and later died in a German concentration camp during the Second World War in 1942. one of the quieter and sadder footnotes in the story of the expedition survivors. Wisting sailed with Amundsen again on the Maud expedition and later became a naval officer. He died in 1936 on board the Fram, which had been put on permanent display in Oslo. He died, in a sense, on the ship that had carried him south. The Fram itself is still there. It sits in the Fram Museum in Oslo, the best preserved wooden polar exploration vessel in the world, and you can walk through it, stand on its deck, look down into its hold, and try to imagine what it felt like to sail south on it in 1910, not entirely sure where you were going or what you would find when you got there. It is a remarkably small ship for the distances it crossed. Most people who see it in person say the same thing, that it is smaller than they expected, which is perhaps the right response. The things that carry people into history are often smaller than the history suggests. What happened after the news broke, and after Scott's death became known, and after the world absorbed both stories at once, was that the age of what people called heroic exploration began to close. Not immediately and not completely, but the South Pole had been reached. The race was over. The blank space on the map was filled. The question that had driven so much effort and cost so many lives, what is at the bottom of the world, had an answer. The answer was ice and altitude and cold and a Norwegian flag and a small tent named Polheim with a letter inside it. And that was enough to change something in the way the world thought about what remained to be discovered. But the story does not quite end with the news breaking or the memorials or the biographies. There is one more thing to consider, what the South Pole became after the men left it, and what it is now, and what it means to stand there today compared to what it meant in December of 1911. That is where this journey finally comes to rest. There is a place at the bottom of the world where the wind moves across a plateau so flat and so vast that there are no shadows, no landmarks, no edges to rest your eyes on. Just white in every direction, and above it, a sky that can be brilliant or grey or both at once, depending on the hour and the season. On December 14th, 1911, 5 men stood in that place for the first time in human history. They planted a flag. They took readings with their instruments. They wrote in their diaries. Then they made camp, ate their meal, and went to sleep. It is that last part that stays with me somehow, the sleeping. After everything it had taken to get there, the years of planning, the secret pivot south, the crossing of the ice shelf, the brutal climb up the Axel Heiberg Glacier, the killing of the dogs, the plateau in whiteout, the final miles of careful navigation. After all of that, they made dinner and went to sleep. Because tomorrow there was still work to do, sun sites to take, positions to confirm, a tent to pitch and name. The extraordinary had become, for these 5 men, a kind of routine, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about Roald Amundsen and the people he chose to travel with. The South Pole today is not empty the way it was then. There is a research station there now, a permanent one, built by the United States and staffed year-round. It is called the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, and the name is deliberately joint, a nod to both men, to both expeditions, to the fact that history has room for more than one story, even when one of them ended in triumph and the other in death. The station was first established in 1956 during the International Geophysical Year, and it has been continuously occupied ever since. There are laboratories there, dormitories, a kitchen, communications equipment, telescopes pointed at the sky. In the Antarctic summer, which is the austral summer, roughly October through February, the population at the station can reach around 200 people. In winter, when the temperatures drop to minus 60 or 70 Celsius and the sun disappears entirely for months, a skeleton crew of around 40 or 50 people remain. They stay through the polar night, doing science, maintaining equipment, and waiting for the light to return, so the blank space on the map is blank no longer. It has buildings on it. It has people in it right now, tonight, as you listen to this, going about their work in one of the most remote and hostile environments on the planet. the geographic South Pole is marked by a simple stake in the ice, topped with a reflective ball surrounded by the flags of the 12 original Antarctic treaty nations. Every year on New Year's Day, the marker is moved. It has to be, because the ice sheet itself is moving, flowing slowly, imperceptibly, but steadily northward toward the coast. The ice moves roughly 10 metres per year. That movement means that the original location where Amundsen's team stood on December 14, 1911, is no longer at the geographic pole. The ice has carried it away. The spot where they planted the Norwegian flag, where they named the plateau for King Haakon, where they left the tent called Polheim, that spot is now roughly 1.5 miles from the pole itself, buried under decades of accumulated snow, somewhere between 30 and 50 feet below the current surface. Polheim is still down there in a sense. The tent fabric, the letter to the king, the note for Scott, they are somewhere beneath the ice, slowly moving, slowly compressing, preserved in the cold and the dark. They will eventually reach the coast tens of thousands of years from now and be released into the sea. The ice does not forget, but it does not stand still. There is something quietly strange about that. The most precisely located moment in the history of polar exploration, the exact coordinates confirmed by careful sun sights over 3 days, is now a location you cannot visit. The place itself has moved. You can stand at 90 degrees south at the current pole marker, and you're not standing where Amundsen stood. You're standing on ice that was not yet there in 1911, on top of more than a century of snowfall, above a landscape that has been slowly rearranging itself the entire time. The geography is fixed, but the ice is not. The pole is a point defined by mathematics, not by any physical feature of the Earth, and the ice that covers it is indifferent to that definition. It moves because that is what ice does. What it means to be first is a question that the story of the South Pole raises without quite answering. Amundsen was first by 34 days, and that margin matters in the record books and in the history books, and it mattered enormously to him personally. He had pivoted his entire career toward this moment, had kept it secret from nearly everyone he knew, had planned it with a precision that left almost nothing to chance. He wanted to be first, and he was. But what did being first actually mean, standing there on that plateau? 5 men and their remaining dogs in the middle of a continent no one lived on. There was no crowd. There was no ceremony beyond what they made for themselves. The world did not know yet. The achievement existed fully and completely, but only for the 5 of them. It would not become real to anyone else until Amundsen reached Hobart months later and sent his telegram. Until then, it was just something that had happened, witnessed only by the ice in the sky. Scott's party reached the same spot 34 days later and found the evidence of what Amundsen had done: the tent, the flag, the letter. And they turned around and began the long walk home, which they did not survive. The difference between first and second in this particular race was not just a matter of record. It was the difference between a triumphant return and a tragedy frozen into the ice. That weight is hard to hold lightly. 34 days. The same destination, the same distance roughly, the same continent, the same year. And yet, the 2 outcomes could not have been more different. What made the difference was not simply luck, though luck played a role. It was the accumulation of hundreds of decisions made over years that added up to one expedition arriving at the pole in better condition, on a better schedule, with better fed men and better performing dogs, and returning home safely, while the other arrived later, exhausted, and did not make it back. Amundsen had thought about almost everything. He had chosen dogs over ponies because he understood dogs in cold weather. He had placed his base 60 miles close to the pole. He had trained his men on skis so they could cover ground efficiently. He had calculated his food depots with enough margin that the men gained weight on the return journey. He had learned from the false start in September and adjusted. He had made the hard decision at the butcher's shop. He had navigated the unknown glacier and crossed the unknown plateau and confirmed his position carefully before leaving. None of that diminishes Scott's courage. It does not diminish the science his expedition produced, which was genuine and significant. It does not diminish the character of the men who died on the return march, who kept their geological samples on the sledge even as they weakened, who wrote letters to their families in the tent at the end. Those men were not failures. They were doing something extraordinarily difficult, and they did it with remarkable composure. The story of Scott's expedition is not a story of incompetence. It is a story of a different philosophy, meeting a set of conditions it was not quite built for, and of weather that was colder than it should have been, and of a series of small misfortunes that compounded into catastrophe. But Amundsen's story is also worth holding in full. Not just the achievement, but the method. The way he treated exploration as a problem to be solved rather than an ordeal to be endured. The way he listened to people who knew things he did not. The Inuit hunters who had taught him about dogs and cold weather clothing years before, during the Northwest Passage voyage, lessons he carried south with him and applied directly. The way he chose his team not for their fame or their connections, but for their specific skills. Bjelland was a champion skier and a craftsman who had lightened the sledges significantly before departure. Hansen was one of the finest dog drivers in Norway. Wisting could handle a sledge in almost any conditions. Hassel was steady and capable. These were not famous men. They were good men, chosen for what they could do. Amundsen himself never quite received the uncomplicated celebration he might have expected. Part of that was the timing. His triumph was immediately shadowed by Scott's death, and the English-speaking world was more drawn to the tragedy than the success. Part of it was his own personality. He was not warm in public. He was not a natural storyteller in the way that some explorers were. He was precise, reserved, and competitive in a way that did not always make people feel comfortable around him. He had kept his plans secret from people who had supported him financially and personally, and some of them never entirely forgave him for it. He was admired, but not always loved. He is celebrated in Norway, where his name is on airports and streets and museums, where the Fram sits in its beautiful museum in Oslo, where his expeditions are understood as among the greatest achievements in Norwegian history. Outside Norway, his reputation has grown steadily over the decades, but it has never quite matched what he actually did. Perhaps that is simply how it goes sometimes. The person who does the thing most effectively does not always become the person history loves most. History loves a story, and Scott's story has a shape that is easier to feel. The brave man who almost made it, the noble failure, the sacrifice. Amundsen's story has a different shape. It is the story of a man who decided what he wanted, prepared as thoroughly as any human being has ever prepared for anything, and then went and did it. Which is admirable, deeply admirable, but perhaps harder to turn into a myth. The 5 men who stood at the pole on December the 14th, 1911, Roald Amundsen, Olaf Bjelland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, Oscar Wisting, all came home from that journey. They descended the glacier, crossed the ice shelf, returned to Framheim, and eventually sailed north and went back to their lives. The world they returned to was the same world they had left mostly, though it was about to change in ways none of them could have predicted. 2.5 years after they reached the pole, the First World War began, and the age that had produced the race to the South Pole, that particular mixture of national ambition, geographic obsession, and romantic heroism, began to dissolve in the mud of the trenches. The heroic age of exploration ended not with a formal announcement, but with a shift in what the world needed and what it was capable of caring about. The ice, meanwhile, continued doing what it had always done, accumulating, compressing, moving slowly toward the coast. The plateau where the 5 men had walked remained exactly as it was, featureless, enormous, indifferent. The cold remained, the silence remained, the altitude remained. No human footprint lasts long on the polar plateau. The wind and the drifting snow erase everything. By the time the next people arrived at the pole, In 1956, there was nothing left of what Amundsen had been there. No mark, no trace, nothing visible. Just ice and the coordinates, and the knowledge that it had been done. That knowledge is the thing that endures, not the flag which is buried and moving, not the tent which is compressed somewhere deep beneath the surface, not the letter to the king, which no one will ever read again. The knowledge that on a specific day in the summer of 1911, 5 human beings from a small country in northern Europe crossed 2,000 miles of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet, reached the southernmost point on Earth, confirmed their position with careful measurements, and came home. That is the fact. It is a fact that cannot be undone or eroded or moved by the flow of ice. It happened, and somewhere in that fact is something worth sitting with quietly for a moment before the night closes in fully. Not a lesson, exactly. Not a moral. Just a recognition that the blank spaces on the map, the ones that seemed impossible, the ones that people spent years and decades and entire careers trying to reach, were never truly blank. They were waiting for someone patient enough to prepare properly, brave enough to go, and honest enough to record what they found when they got there. The ice shelf is quiet tonight. The plateau is dark because the austral winter has come and the sun will not return for months. The Amundsen Scott station is lit from within, a small cluster of warmth in an enormous cold, its instruments measuring the atmosphere and the ice and the cosmic radiation passing through from space. The geographic pole marker stands in the dark outside, surrounded by flags that barely move in the still air. And somewhere beneath the ice, moving slowly, in the direction of the sea, is a small tent that 5 men named Polheim and left standing on the 14th of December in the year 1911. Sleep well wherever you are tonight, and may the blank spaces in your own world be the kind that are worth crossing,